Around the world, historians, archaeologists, and other experts are trying to get to the bottom of some of the most fascinating mysteries in human history. Every year, new mysteries are solved, but just as many are uncovered as we get a clearer look back into the past. Before modern technology, map makers had to rely on the accounts of explorers and other sailors to draw the coastlines of far-off lands. When those lands were located in places that were rarely visited, a mistake might take decades to be spotted and corrected. This was one of the ways that the Phantom Islands might appear on maps. Phantom Islands are islands that were once recorded on maps, only for later exploration to prove they didn't exist. One of these Phantom Islands was New South Greenland. New South Greenland was first recorded in the account of American explorer Benjamin Morrell during his 1822-23 expedition of the seas around Antarctica. Antarctica had only been spotted by European explorers a few years earlier, and the landmass still mostly remained a mystery. In 1822, Morrell set off in his ship, the Wasp, to explore these new lands. In his account, he wrote about visiting various parts of the ocean surrounding Antarctica. For the most part, the account is unremarkable, although some discrepancies raised alarms. On one occasion, he claimed to have sailed at coordinates that would later be revealed to be deep within the Antarctic landmass. But at the time, the area was so unexplored that it was impossible to say for certain what was correct and what was actually factual. But one part that stood out to readers was the discovery of a new land. This land was given the name New South Greenland. Morrell claimed that it had been spotted in the distance from the Crown's Nest. The Wasp tried to get closer, but ice meant that the ship could never get too close. Instead, they followed along its coastline for several miles. Morrell recorded seabirds and seals lying on the land, as well as snow-covered mountains in the distance. The mysterious land of New South Greenland was located in the Weddell Sea, an area that was extremely remote and had only been visited a few times in the past. Even though many of his contemporaries were skeptical, they couldn't say for certain that New South Greenland didn't exist. The fact that Morrell wrote about it only briefly, and deep inside a lengthy book about everything else he saw in Antarctica, made some believe him. But later expeditions would reveal that the island could not have existed. At least one explorer, James Clark Ross, claimed to have seen land around the location that Morrell wrote about, but others were able to disprove the island's existence. This image depicts a group of Polish soldiers on horseback, and one could be forgiven for thinking that it shows a battalion of men who are about to charge their enemy and emerge victorious. The fact is that it was taken shortly before the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and that none of these men made it out alive. The invasion began on the 1st of September that year, with German offenses arriving by land and air. The aim of the attack was to regain territories that had been lost and to take control of the country in the name of Germany. The invading forces used a technique known as blitzkrieg, during which they would first destroy the enemy's railways, communications, planes, and ammunition via bombing before large numbers of soldiers attacked by land. Following this, the infantry would attack and do away with any remaining pockets of opposing soldiers. But before any of this could be done, the Polish army felt that it had a good chance of emerging as the victor in the expected battle. They had a force of 1 million men and could surely hold their own. This was certainly a possibility, were it not for several mistakes that were made early on. Polish soldiers were ill-equipped for a prolonged battle, and when the German side did attack, they fought back head-on rather than with a specific strategy. They relied heavily on their offense rather than retreating to more favorable ground, and it soon became clear that those in charge of the Polish army were used to the antiquated fighting techniques and strategies. Still, they had hope that aid would come from Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, who they believed to be allies. But that hope was dashed with the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact, which stipulated that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other for the next 10 years. It also contained a secret stipulation whereby Eastern Europe was divided into German and Soviet spheres of influence. This included the partitioning of Poland, and hence that country unwittingly stood on the precipice of disaster. The invasion officially began on the 1st of September 1939, when a German battleship attacked a Polish military transit depot in Danzig. This was followed by an attack, which was considered by many historians to be the very beginning of the Second World War. Soon, several cities were under attack, as were Poland's southern, western, and northern borders. News of the attacks spread quickly, and on the 3rd of September, France and Britain declared war on Germany. But they failed to provide any useful support. The Polish army saw some success during smaller skirmishes, but for the most part, they were overrun thanks to Germany's modern equipment, technical superiority, and sheer number of soldiers. Polish soldiers were forced to retreat to Warsaw, with some fleeing into Romania. The Polish forces saw major Air Force bases destroyed within just 2 days, and hence the German Air Force saw very little resistance. Within the first week, Pomerelia, Greater Poland, and Upper Silesia were abandoned, and the borders were overrun. From the 9th of September to the 19th, the largest of the 3 battles took place near the Bezura River. Polish forces were overpowered by German aircraft. Bridges over the river were destroyed, leaving soldiers trapped, and many lost their lives in the air bombings that followed. Polish anti-aircraft weapons no longer had any ammunition left and were quickly wiped out. This was followed by an invasion by the Soviet Union, and when all was said and done, Poland had fallen. It was divided up between Germany and the Soviet Union, and it would only be in 1993 that the Soviet soldiers finally left the country after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989. The origins of the Uralic language family have baffled linguistic experts for years. Millions of people across multiple countries speak languages belonging to the family. But how these groups relate to one another and why they're separate from other groups has long remained a mystery. New DNA evidence has finally shed light on this historical mystery. Today, the most well-known examples of Uralic languages are Hungarian, Finnish, and Estonian. Other languages belonging to the family are spoken in northern Russia, in clusters around the Ural Mountains, and in northern Norway. The languages are completely distinct from Indo-European, the language family that most European languages belong to. Historians have been able to map the spread of this language family, although its exact origins are still debated. But the spread of Uralic has been much harder to determine. As the name would suggest, many linguists believed the origin of the Uralic language family was somewhere in the Ural Mountains. This mountain range in western Russia was a major obstacle to movement throughout human history. It's here where most of the Uralic languages are spoken today, with different groups of the language sitting on either side of the range. But this wasn't the only theory. Another theory suggested that the language originated somewhere further east. There appears to be some connection to Turkic and Mongolian languages, 2 other language groups that are not believed to be part of the Indo-European language family. As these 2 languages don't seem to have spread from the Ural Mountains, some linguists have theorized that the Uralic languages must have passed through other regions before reaching the Urals and Eastern Europe. New DNA evidence has backed up that theory. A 2025 study analyzed modern and ancient DNA from Russia, comparing it to modern Uralic speakers. It revealed that Uralic speakers shared DNA traces from Yakutia, northeast Siberia, a marker absent in other groups, thus connecting Uralic languages. Researchers believe hypermobile hunter-gatherers spread the language, primarily westward, during the Indo-European expansion. But the boreal forest prevented its spread north, where most Uralic languages are found today. While Yakutia DNA levels vary in Uralic-speaking regions, Hungary, an anomaly, shows minimal traces, though medieval conquerors who brought the Hungarian language did possess higher levels. This research clarifies the spread of these ancient languages and may inform understanding of their eastward expansion. The name Martin Marprelate isn't too well known, especially compared to other writers publishing in the Elizabethan period. But Marprelate had a huge impact on English satire and religion. Who he really was remains a mystery to this day. The Elizabethan period was one of a lot of change for England, not least of all in terms of religion. In the 1580s, what exactly the Church of England was going to look like was still being debated. Many believed that the Anglican Church should continue to follow many of the same practices as the Church in Rome. Others wanted a bigger change. These were the people known as the Puritans. While the arguing continued, the government ruled that the Archbishop of Canterbury would have the power to license and control all the printing presses in England and Wales. This significantly restricted those who wanted to publish anything against the church. But one mysterious individual found a way around those restrictions. In October of 1588, a pamphlet began to appear on the streets of London. It was the first tract written by the mysterious Martin Marprelate. The name was obviously a pseudonym. A prelate is a bishop or another high-ranking church official. Martin's pamphlets would definitely mar or harm these church officials. The pamphlets combined wit, humor, and religious doctrine to make points against the current state of the church. Martin was able to highlight members of the church government and the government of the realm and point out their flaws as well as flaws in their ideas. The attacks could be quite personal at times. For example, he aimed at the low-born Bishop of Winchester, Bishop Cooper, calling him a tub trimmer. He also referred to the Archbishop of Canterbury as his Grease rather than his Grace. But the pamphlets also made sure to focus attacks on their politics and the government of the church. Both the church and the secular government issued statements against the pamphlets and tried to catch the person or people responsible. Church officials published lengthy pieces which didn't have any of the same humor as the Marprelate tracts and wouldn't appeal to the same general audience as the shorter, funnier pieces. The government would hire a group of respected writers to try to mimic Martin's work and attack the writer himself, but as they had no idea who he was, they could only make general attacks against the stereotype of a Puritan. In September of 1589, the printing press that Marprelate had been using was seized. This was a movable press, and the people publishing the tracts had been moving it a lot over the past year. It had traveled around Wales and the English Midlands, being kept in the homes of Puritans and sympathizers, even though what they were doing was considered illegal. The press was found with its owner, John Penry, a Welsh priest. Penry had published pieces arguing in favor of a Puritan church before, but he didn't have the same style or wit as Martin Marprelate. While some believe he may have been responsible for the pamphlets, most scholars believe the culprit was someone else. There are thousands of unique and intriguing items housed in Cairo's Egyptian Museum. A small wooden statue of a bird wouldn't normally gather much attention compared to the likes of golden artifacts from the tomb of Tutankhamun and statues of pharaohs. But the saqqara bird has attracted worldwide attention. Its purpose and origin continue to baffle experts to this day. The statue was found in the tomb of Imet, located in Saqqara. Saqqara is located not far from Memphis and served as a necropolis during the late and Greek periods. It wasn't only Egypt's powerful and elite that were mummified and buried in shafts beneath the sand. Most of the mummies found here belonged to the middle class, and many were buried in mass tombs, where many people from different families were entombed together. Exactly what kind of tomb this was has been forgotten, but an excavation took place in 1898. Unfortunately, details of the excavation weren't preserved either. We don't know exactly what condition the tomb was in, or where the small model bird was located, but it was brought back to be housed at the museum in Cairo, where it first began to attract the attention of scholars. The saqqara bird has a wingspan of about 18 centimeters and weighs just 39 grams. It was made from sycamore wood. It dates to around 200 BC, during the Ptolemaic period. What caught people's attention was the strange shape of the bird. The tail feathers of most birds fan out horizontally, but the saqqara birds are vertical. To modern eyes, it resembled an airplane with a bird's face carved into the front rather than an actual bird. This led to speculation that the saqqara object may have represented some kind of flying device. The first person to put forward this theory was Khalil Messiah, an Egyptian physician and dowser. He thought the statue looked too strange to be a representation of an animal, and suggested it may have been a model for a glider. He believed that there had once been a horizontal stabilizer sitting on top of the rear tail feathers, and when this was added, the bird would function like a glider. There was no evidence that this stabilizer actually existed, though. Experiments to prove this have been mixed. Some have given positive results, while others suggest that even with the stabilizer, the glider would have been difficult to handle and only would have moved a couple yards. A 2023 study using a scan of the bird and computer simulations proved that it would not fly. Even if the model was theoretically capable of flight, the fact that Egyptologists have only found one small model as evidence that the Egyptians in the classical era were capable of flight seems to suggest this wasn't its actual purpose. But if this wasn't the purpose of the saqqara bird, that leaves the question of its real function a mystery. Linear elamite is one of the most important ancient writing systems that still remains a mystery to experts. The writing system was used by the mysterious Elamite people between 2300 and 1850 BC, but only a few dozen examples of the writing have been uncovered to date. Deciphering the script might help scholars to understand more about these ancient people who lived in modern-day Iran thousands of years ago. It was around the year 1903 when the first examples of linear elamite started to be uncovered by archaeologists. A French team of researchers were excavating Susa, Iran. It was believed that this was the center of the Elamite civilization. The Elamites were believed to be one of the most important civilizations in the early urbanization of the Near East, and were neighbors with Babylonia and Sumeria. The linear Elamite inscriptions were obviously distinct from cuneiform. The wedge-shaped markings that cuneiform is famous for were missing. Instead, the script seemed to be made up of a variety of symbols that frequently featured crosses, diamonds, and box-like shapes. The discovery immediately excited scholars, who began to try to crack the unsolved mystery. But in the century after the discovery, only a few symbols could be understood. One of the biggest problems facing researchers was that there was no bilingual translation. The Rosetta Stone, a trilingual inscription which repeated the same information in 3 different languages, had been essential for cracking the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but no such inscription could be found from ancient Elam. There were also a few artifacts that included both linear elamite and cuneiform, but experts don't believe that the same information was held in both. The inscriptions were not a direct translation to one another either. Another problem was the fact that the Elamite language itself was unknown. The writing system was presumably being used to write Elamite, but researchers had no idea what it might have sounded like or what the grammatical rules for this language were. Elamite is a language that went extinct thousands of years ago and doesn't have any known relatives. In 2022, a team of researchers announced that they had deciphered most of the linear Elamite. The decipherment began with 2 silver beakers, which had actually been held in a London bank for decades. The beakers had been taken from an Elamite archaeological site when the rules surrounding the archaeological digs in that area were loose. Many experts believed the beakers were a forgery, but the team of researchers in the 2022 decipherment believed them to be genuine. Many were optimistic about the decipherment, which began by translating the names of kings and expanded to find the corresponding sounds for 96% of the known symbols. Others were more skeptical. The researchers claimed that linear Elamite was almost entirely an alpha syllabary. This meant that the symbols corresponded to sounds, similar to how letters in the modern Latin alphabet do. At the time, all known languages were at least partially logographic, meaning that individual symbols corresponded with an entire word rather than just a sound. The earliest writing systems evolved from symbols for words. If linear Elamite was an alpha syllabary, it would represent the earliest known example of this form of writing. This image shows a beach with a few beachgoers wading out into the water and a sailboat drifting nearby. At first glance, it's a tranquil and fun scene, but in reality, it serves as a precursor to an unspeakable tragedy that occurred on the 26th of December, 2004. What isn't immediately apparent in this photo is the fact that the area's shoreline has retracted much further than it usually does, even at low tide. Those in the know will tell you that if this ever happens while you're at the beach, you should do your utmost to flee and find higher ground as soon as possible. The reason for this warning is that a tsunami is about to strike, and this image serves as solid proof of that fact. On this day, a magnitude 9.1 undersea earthquake occurred in the waters off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia, but the people in the photo were none the wiser. Just moments later, a massive tsunami started speeding towards the coast, and it's safe to assume that no one in this photo managed to escape its destructive force. It was followed by a series of tsunamis that formed in the Indian Ocean over the following 7 hours, causing massive amounts of damage and ending the lives of thousands of people. Some of these tsunamis reached as far as the eastern coast of Africa, and in some areas, witnesses described seeing waves as tall as 30 feet barreling toward the coast and then destroying everything in their paths. To this day, it's considered one of the worst natural disasters to have ever occurred. Within hours, tens of thousands of people were unaccounted for and were either reported as missing or found deceased. 15 countries were affected by the quake and the resulting tsunamis, including Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand and India. Indonesia was by far the worst affected, as it was reported that as many as 200,000 people lost their lives, most of whom hailed from one single province. What followed was a struggle for survival as people were left without shelter, clean drinking water, and food. Relief organizations did their best to aid those in need, but the number of people who needed help was overwhelming, and many areas had been left inaccessible thanks to roads that were destroyed. The photo in question serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a situation can change from one of bliss and tranquility to one of terror and loss. In 1910, the race to become the first expedition to reach the South Pole was on, and one British explorer, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, had made up his mind that he and his men would be the ones to do so. But he wasn't merely chasing recognition. He and his crew were also planning on conducting research along the Ross Ice Shelf, specifically in the Victoria Land region. From the get-go, Scott and his chief scientist, Edward Adrian Wilson, had differing opinions on the ultimate goal of the expedition. Wilson felt that the scientific research that was about to be conducted at the ice shelf should be the main priority, but Scott had his mind set on becoming the first explorer to reach the South Pole in the name of Britain, and he was anxious to get going, since an expedition from Norway was preparing to do the same. On the 15th of June, 1910, Scott's crew was assembled and ready, and they set off on their journey with a few guests on board who would also be given certain duties to perform. They set sail from Cardiff, Wales, but Scott would only join his crew later on in South Africa, as he'd been delayed by certain details that had to be ironed out. By January of 1911, they'd reached Antarctica, where they faced temperatures of around -70 Fahrenheit. For the next 10 months, they readied themselves for the trek to the South Pole and set out from their base camp on the 1st of November. Not long into the journey, they had to abandon their motorized sledges due to the rough terrain, and their ponies started to suffer due to the harsh conditions and minimal food. By the 4th of January, though, they'd made good progress and were preparing for the final push to the pole. Scott decided that only a few of his crew would go ahead, and he chose 4 men to accompany him on the last 150 miles of the journey. The other 4 men turned back to base camp, with one man suffering from scurvy and snow blindness along the way, but he managed to survive thanks to the efforts of his companions. Scott's party forged ahead and reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, but they were left distraught upon spotting dog tracks in the snow. And to make matters worse, a Norwegian flag had been planted by an earlier expedition. The men's morale was devastated by the discovery, and 2 days later they started back to base camp with the knowledge that they had lost the race. Nevertheless, they continued gathering geological samples whenever they could, despite fearing for their lives as they were running very low on supplies. Scurvy, hypothermia, and starvation had started to set in, and at one point they stopped to take the photo in question, and it's clear from the expressions on their faces they felt defeated and worse for wear. Shortly after reaching the base of Beardmore Glacier, Edward Evans passed away after sustaining a serious head injury. Captain Frank Oates knew there were too many mouths to feed, and while suffering from frostbite, decided to walk out into the frozen wasteland, never to return, giving up his life so that the remainder of the party would survive. But the thing is, this was done in vain. The rest of the crew wrote letters to their families, and 8 months later, a rescue party found their tents with their frozen remains inside. In 1927, archaeologists excavating a temple complex in Cambodia made an astonishing discovery. It wouldn't be until almost 100 years later that the rest of the discovery could be made. Ta Prohm is one of the most famous temples at the Angkor temple complex. Construction began on the temple in 1187, and once built, it took thousands of people to maintain it. It was dedicated to the mother of Jayavarman VII. In the centuries since its construction, Ta Prohm has fallen into ruins. The Cambodian jungle has reclaimed much of the temple, cracking giant ancient stones and slowly pulling apart the bricks. Trees and other foliage still cling to the temple walls, although today they're maintained and the temple isn't truly wild. That doesn't stop it from attracting visitors, and it was even a location used during the filming of a Lara Croft Tomb Raider movie. While the temple is an important tourist attraction, archaeological work continues to uncover insights into Cambodia's past. These excavations have been taking place for over a century. In 1927, when the area was under French control, archaeologists uncovered the head of a large Buddha statue. The statue was in the Bayan art style, and researchers believe the features were based on those of Jayavarman VII. It was dated to the 12th or 13th century. The head clearly belonged to part of a larger statue, but there was no sign of this statue in the dig. The intriguing artifact was taken to the National Museum of Cambodia, where it was protected and studied. Archaeological work continued at the Angkor complex, although it was often disrupted by events going on in the region. More recently, though, international teams of archaeologists have been able to explore the area again, uncovering new artifacts and revealing more secrets about what Cambodia's past was like. In early 2025, a group of archaeologists from India uncovered something that would solve a long-standing mystery. It was the body of a statue, roughly 4 feet in height, and missing its head, feet, and one of its hands. The feet had been located elsewhere in the rubble, but the head was nowhere to be found. But advanced technology, including digital scanning, solved the mystery of the fragmented statue at Ta Prohm. A head found decades ago near the body was a perfect match. The statue, unique for its left hand on the chest, presents new questions for scholars, such as the reason for its pose and how it was broken. Possibilities for its damage include natural causes like tree roots and weathering, or deliberate destruction during religious shifts or colonial times. At the end of the Second World War, tens of thousands of American service personnel were considered missing in action. In the decades since then, many remains have been recovered, providing answers to family members left behind. Many more still remain missing. In November of 2023, the family of Gilbert Haldine Myers were finally able to lay him to rest. The mystery began 8 decades earlier, on July 10, 1943. Myers was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Forces, serving in the 381st Bombardment Squadron, 310th Bombardment Group. At the time of his disappearance, the group's job involved flying over Sicily and attacking military targets there. July 10th was like any other day. Myers was the co-pilot of a B-25 Mitchell, flying alongside 5 other men. Their target was the Saqqara airdrome. This was an important airbase for the Axis forces. Many missions had been dispatched from the site, hidden among olive trees that camouflaged it from enemy view. Malta, in particular, had been damaged by planes flown from Saqqara, but in 1942, the airbase had finally been photographed by an RAF pilot, and now a full campaign against the site was being enacted by American troops. Myers' plane dropped its payload on the target, but as it did so, it came under anti-aircraft fire. The plane was hit and rapidly lost altitude. According to witnesses on the ground, one person in the plane bailed out, but the others could not escape before the plane crashed, and there were no survivors. The campaign in Saqqara was a success, and the area soon fell into Allied hands. In the years after the disappearance, searches took place to try to locate the remains of the 6 men who lost their lives in the crash. It soon emerged that the pilot had been located by civilians and buried at a nearby cemetery. There were also rumors that German soldiers had removed 3 bodies from the crash site, but there was no information on where they had been taken. There was no word of anybody being taken prisoner, and authorities were certain they were searching for remains. In 1944, part of the wreckage was discovered by American investigators, but no human remains were found. After the war, the area was returned to the farmers who'd worked the land before it was taken over by the Italian military. Searches for any further remains took place, but the terrain made this difficult, and nothing was found. A 2022 investigation into a B-25 crash site uncovered wreckage, though, and human remains. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Myers, one of the 6 lost airmen. He was buried in Florida in 2023. And while this solved one mystery, the remains of the other 4 flyers still remain missing. The plague of Justinian was one of the most devastating events in human history. The disease cost the lives of millions of people across Europe and northern Africa, and changed society forever in the places where it hit the hardest. But for centuries, exactly what the disease was has remained a mystery, one only solved recently. The plague first arrived in North Africa in 541 CE. For a long time, Egypt had been the breadbasket of the Eastern Roman Empire, feeding the growing population, especially in the empire's major population centers. So a huge amount of grain was being shipped from the center of the plague outbreak in Constantinople and other cities. Disease-ridden rats hopped aboard the grain ships, and soon the disease was spreading rapidly through the empire. Historians aren't certain just how devastating the disease actually was. There's a belief that many of the writers at the time were exaggerating just how bad things were. But we do know that millions of people lost their lives. In some places, burial practices couldn't keep up with the numbers. Entire families were wiped out, and the disease reached every level of society. Even the Emperor Justinian caught the disease. Luckily for him, he managed to survive, and the empire itself didn't completely collapse. The empire would recover once the worst of the plagues had passed, although it would be hundreds of years before the outbreak was considered over. Given how prevalent the disease was, there were plenty of descriptions of it for modern historians to try to piece together its identity. According to the writer Procopius, those suffering from the disease had delusions, nightmares, and fevers. The most telling symptom, though, was swelling in the groin, armpits, and behind the ears. Some victims would lapse into a coma, where only the actions of dedicated family members could keep them alive. To historians, this sounded a lot like the horrific accounts of the Black Death that would sweep through Europe centuries later. Despite how horrifying the Justinian plague was, it didn't come close to the damage done by that later incident, though, which wiped out at least a quarter of Europe's population. But that didn't mean this wasn't a strain of the same disease. It wouldn't be until 2013 that there was anything to confirm this. In that year, scientists were able to analyze the remains of a victim found in a graveyard in Germany. DNA analysis revealed the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria responsible for the bubonic plague. After the Second World War, reports emerged of a secret German military base housed in the Antarctic. For a long time, many suspected it was nothing more than a story, but evidence has since proven that this secret base did exist. Its true purpose, though, may remain a mystery. The Schatzgraber base was located on the island of Alexandra Land, a remote island high within the Arctic Circle, which is now part of Russia. Work began on building the secret complex in 1942, but it wouldn't begin operating until the following year. Officially, the base was a weather station and was manned by 4 meteorologists as well as 5 soldiers. At first, this purpose seems to make sense. The weather could make or break a mission. Many ocean vessels had been sunk not from enemy combat, but from coming across poor weather conditions. Making sure the enemy had the most accurate information possible was essential to securing the best chances for victory. There was also the fact that merchant ships were sailing between the Western Allied nations and the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, making it an important area for German U-boats hoping to sink the supply ships. The Arctic region was popular for weather bases. The Americans, British, and Russians all had weather bases in the region, so it wouldn't have looked out of place for a German base to be located here, even if the territory was technically within the Soviet Union. But less than a year before the Schatzgraber base began operating, it had to be abandoned. The base had to be resupplied by airdrops, and food would occasionally run low. In May of 1944, 2 of the staff members hunted a polar bear and brought it back to the base to eat. The meat was undercooked, and the staff became extremely sick. Only one person, the base medic, hadn't eaten the food and had to contact the Navy to report the incident. All 9 men were evacuated. For reasons unknown, nobody would come to take over their positions, and the base was abandoned. This strange abandonment has left many questioning the true purpose of the base. In 1944, it would have been more important than ever to have the weather information that the base was allegedly gathering. Even if the story concerning the polar bear meat was true, there doesn't seem to be an explanation for why nobody came to replace the crew. One theory is that there was more to the base than just weather research. In the latter stages of 2019, the police and military in Chile were embroiled in a delicate situation when a protest held by a group of students escalated into a larger protest that lasted 2 months, and in some instances, they had to resort to using tear gas and fire hoses to disperse the angry crowds. It all started on the 18th of October that year when the Chilean government announced an increase in the subway fare in Santiago, and students decided to protest against it. Unfortunately, not all of these protests were peaceful, and the police were called in to try to restore order. Soon, protests were being held in several other parts of the country, and the military was deployed, but the protesters were unwilling to disperse, and before long a political crisis was declared. Within just 4 days, 15 people had lost their lives in the ensuing violence and in clashes with the authorities, as more people started to join the protests, but for different reasons. They stated that they had enough of economic inequality in that country, and that something had to be done about it. These events took the Chilean government by surprise, and political parties were asked to convene so that a solution could be found. It was suggested that the country's constitution be replaced, and a new one was drafted. Initially, the new constitution saw a lot of support, but it was ultimately rejected, and in the years that have followed, very little progress has been made. In this photo, which has since been shared all over the internet, protesters can be seen wiping their eyes and leaning against a wall after being exposed to tear gas, highlighting the dire situation that Chile was facing at the time. As the protests continued to escalate, 2 churches were set on fire, one of which was almost completely destroyed. Banks were also targeted, and one police station was attacked with explosives. As is so often the case with violent protests, stores were damaged, and looters started stealing anything they could get their hands on. Nevertheless, the government's efforts to bring calm to the country failed, and when nothing had changed a year later, a fresh set of protests started. This time, 18 police officers were injured while trying to calm the crowd that was demanding that the Constitution be rewritten once more. The government responded by appealing for calm and asking that anyone who had an issue with the Constitution make their feelings known via referendum. They also warned members of the public that anyone who was caught engaging in acts of violence would be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but this did little to quell the growing violence. During the escalating violence, at least 30 people lost their lives, and thousands more had to receive treatment in hospitals. A second draft of a new constitution was rejected in 2023, and at present, efforts are being made to complete one that will be accepted by all involved, but only time will tell whether a third attempt will be successful. Sometimes the clue that solves a historic mystery is only found after re-looking at old evidence with fresh eyes. This may be how a biblical mystery related to an Assyrian king is finally solved. Sennacherib was one of the most famous Assyrian kings. He ruled the empire between 705 and 681 BC. His reign involved many military campaigns within his own empire, including the destruction of the city of Babylon in 701. But he's most well known for the Levantine War and his siege of the city of Jerusalem. Sennacherib's campaigns in Judah are retold in the Old Testament. According to this story, an angel struck Sennacherib's campsite outside Jerusalem and took the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Sennacherib escaped with his life, and a peace agreement was made with the kingdom of Judah. Assyrian sources and chronicles from other kingdoms in the area are less fantastical, and modern scholars believe that King Hezekiah may have paid for Sennacherib to leave. It wasn't only the outcome of the war that scholars have debated. Another mystery is where exactly Sennacherib's camps were placed. Solving this mystery involved looking back at carvings that once decorated Sennacherib's palace. The art depicted some of the highlights of Sennacherib's rule, including military campaigns. Art historians looking at these reliefs again noticed something unusual. Sennacherib's camps were elliptical in shape and divided into sections, which contained the king's royal quarters and soldiers' tents. The camps would have been surrounded by defensive walls. The details depicted in the reliefs have never been thought about much, but now some scholars believe they could hold the key to solving the mystery of the locations of the camps. One researcher took to the earliest aerial photos of the area looking for any evidence of these elliptical structures. Jerusalem wasn't the only city that had been attacked during the ancient war, and the initial focus of the study was the city of Lachish. This was a fortified city on top of a hill, and one of the campaigns depicted in the reliefs. Previously, it was believed that Sennacherib's camp would have been at the bottom of the hill, but re-examining the reliefs showed that there was a second hill positioned between Lachish and the campsite. Going back over the aerial photos, researchers found a hill and the remains of an oval structure. The direction of the oval matched that depicted in the relief. Archaeological records showed that there had been a period of activity in the area around the time of Sennacherib's campaign, but before this, there'd been nothing. After this, there was also nothing. This wasn't the site of a long-established settlement. It had only been occupied for the short time of Sennacherib's siege. With one site at Lachish located, researchers turned their attention to the camp that would have been made near Jerusalem. Previous archaeological work had already located a scene of a military camp in the area, but this was believed to be Roman and part of the siege of the city in the 1st century. But once again, the elliptical pattern could be seen when viewing the camp from above. Roman military camps were typically rectangular in nature. The two sites proved to be promising and could potentially be the locations where ancient men prepared for battle that would be remembered thousands of years later. But other researchers have warned against declaring the mystery solved too soon. Archaeological research will need to take place at both potential camps before this mystery can officially be considered solved. In 2020, archaeologists began excavation work on an intriguing tomb located in China's Anhui province. The tomb was believed to be older than the famous mausoleum of China's first emperor, surrounded by the terracotta army. But who exactly was inside remained unknown. Today, scholars have a good idea of who exactly was buried in an intricate coffin over 2,200 years ago, an important figure from before China's unification. The wuwangdun tomb is one of the most impressive ever discovered in China. It's housed beneath a burial mound some 14 meters high, which would have made it stand out from the surrounding landscape. Buried beneath the mound is a burial chamber divided into 9 rooms, with each one housing intricate works of art and musical instruments. In the central room stood the coffin, inscribed in over 1,000 characters that had originally been written using Chinese ink. The tomb was obviously designed for someone important, and immediately experts wanted to solve the mystery of who that important figure was. Dating the tomb would be the first step to getting to the bottom of that mystery. It was estimated that the tomb dated to around 200 BC, shortly before the end of China's Warring States period. This was a time when the land we know today as China was controlled by 7 different states. By 221 BC, the state of Qin had annexed or taken over the 6 other states, unifying China under one state once more. One of the states that was annexed by Qin was Chu. Chu was one of the geographically largest states, located around the valleys of the Han and Yangtze rivers. Importantly, it also occupied the location where the wuwangdun tomb was located. The Chu state was known for its artistic expertise, which definitely came across in the artifacts that were buried within the tomb. Many of the items had never been seen in other Chinese tombs. Artifacts included carved heads made from lacquerware, divination turtle shells, and instruments. The tomb also included hundreds of wooden statues. Some of these represented guards similar to the terracotta army, but others were housed in the room dedicated to music and may have represented the tomb owner's ceremonial entourage and entertainment troupe, accompanying him into the afterlife. It wasn't long into the excavation work that some experts began to put forward a theory about who might have been buried in the coffin. Putting together the chronology of the site and assuming that this was in fact a royal resting place, the obvious answer was King Kaoli of Chu. Kaoli ruled the Chu state from 262 to 238 BC. By this point in the Warring States period, Chu seemed to be more focused on the arts than on war, but Kaoli did defeat and annex the Lu state, one of the smaller states to Chu's north. Kaoli was succeeded by 3 of his sons before the Chu state finally fell to the Qin. While the theory that this was Kaoli's tomb began to spread almost as soon as the excavation work began, scholars held back on making any official announcement. But in January 2025, the CCTV announced that the mystery was officially solved. This was Kaoli's tomb. There are few relics as controversial or as well studied as the Shroud of Turin. While many scholars have claimed their studies have solved the mystery of the Shroud, it's unlikely that this mystery will ever be put to rest. One thing to make clear here is that regardless of your religious beliefs, and regardless of your historical beliefs, sharing this story isn't meant to sway you one way or the other. There are mountains of evidence that point towards the Shroud of Turin being legitimate, but there's also a significant amount of evidence that suggests it may not be. Regardless of where you land on the subject, we're merely sharing some interesting information that we found after scientists published some recent information on the subject. The Shroud of Turin was first written about in modern history in the Champagne region of France in the mid-1300s. It briefly faded into obscurity before reappearing in Turin, Italy, where it's remained ever since. The shroud supposedly has the image of a man with crucifixion wounds imprinted into the fabric. The man has long hair and a beard, and is believed by many to be the shroud that Jesus' body was covered with when he was laid to rest after the crucifixion. It was recognized as an important religious relic all the way from its time of creation up until the 1980s, when carbon dating allegedly placed the origin of the shroud around the year 1300s. But those studies have since been debunked, and others have claimed that there's evidence that the shroud can be dated back to the 1st century. A more recent study, published in 2025 though, has turned away from trying to date the shroud and has begun looking elsewhere for answers. According to believers, the image on the shroud was created by an extreme burst of light that left behind an imprint of what was touching the fabric at the time. But an analysis using 3D modeling proved that this may not be the case. The study compared a fabric draped across a body and one draped across a low-relief carving. These carvings were often used on gravestones in medieval times and could be made from stone, wood, or even metal. The impression left by a full body left warping, as the curves of the 3D features would make any impression spread and appear much wider than the original image. But the impression left by a low-relief carving showed no such thing. When comparing digital models of the two fabrics, the one covering a low-relief carving almost exactly matched the imprint on the Shroud of Turin. The other, showing the imprint that would have been left by a body, was much wider and did not resemble the famous relic. The study author believes that this is proof that the shroud was a piece of religious art and may have been intended as a piece of grave art when it was created. He suggested that the impression could have been made by heating a metal carving, leaving behind the marks that believers claim were caused by a burst of light. Critics of the supposed new hypothesis note that the low-relief model hypothesis has been proposed before, many times actually, but it's still never been proven. Experts argue that the model ignores the chemistry, forensic, and other scientific findings related to the Shroud of Turin, such as the fact that it can be dated back throughout history to the time of the crucifixion, and pollen spores embedded into the fibers of the shroud seem to confirm this, as well as the exact type of fibers that it's made from. There have also been claims to debunk the shroud, which suggests that a piece of its fiber was tested and only dated back to medieval times. But this fragment of the shroud that was tested was actually found to have come from a patch on the outer edge of the shroud, a patch that had already been confirmed to have been stitched onto the shroud during medieval times, meaning this entire test was botched from the start. There is evidence to argue either side, and while many claim that the Shroud of Turin has been fully debunked, others aren't so sure. 3 men shown in this photo are in a very dangerous and desperate situation. But what most people tend to forget is that a 4th man, the photographer, is in just as much danger, and in this instance, the situation would end in tragedy. The 3 men that we can see are all firefighters who are doing their utmost to gain entry into a warehouse in Beirut, Lebanon, on the 4th of August, 2020. But the events leading up to this moment started 7 years earlier in 2013, when a merchant ship called the MV Rosas, which was sailing in the area, started experiencing technical issues. It had set sail from Batumi in Georgia and was heading to Beira in Mozambique, but it was forced to dock in Beirut for repairs. This meant that docking fees had to be paid, but the company that owns the ship failed to do so, and as a result, the ship's cargo was removed and stored in this warehouse. Among the cargo was about 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which can be extremely dangerous, and under the right circumstances can be highly explosive. After learning that the cargo was stored in the warehouse, officials from Lebanon's customs department issued several warnings, stating that the ammonium nitrate had to be stored in a very specific way, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. For 7 years, the cargo remained untouched in the warehouse, and a disaster was bound to happen sooner or later. That day arrived on the 4th of August 2020, when a fire broke out at the port, a short distance from the warehouse in this photo. Ammonium nitrate can start to degrade when it's heated in a confined space, but the firefighters who rushed to the scene were unaware that it was being stored in this warehouse. 10 of them started fighting the fire that was encroaching on the warehouse and the cargo that it contained. The 3 firefighters in the photo decided to try and gain entry into the warehouse, and a photographer who was on the scene captured their brave attempt, not knowing that disaster was about to strike. Moments after the photo was taken, the ammonium nitrate detonated, claiming the lives of all 4 men. It would only be later, after the fire had been extinguished, that the photographer's camera was found, and remarkably, the SD card that he was using was undamaged. The resulting blast has been dubbed the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded, and a large part of the city was completely destroyed. More than 20 people lost their lives, 6,000 were injured, and 100 remained unaccounted for. The blast was so great that it caused as much as $10 billion worth of damage to the city, and 300,000 people were left destitute. In September of 2025, a businessman named Igor Grachushkin was arrested in Bulgaria after it was found that he had links to the ship and its cargo, and Lebanon issued an order to have him extradited, but this process has been delayed, since his attorneys have asked for assurance that he'll not be eligible for the death penalty when he faces trial. Gympie ape is a strange artifact that has puzzled experts and tourists alike for decades. Almost 60 years after it was first discovered, where exactly the artifact originated and what it was for remains a mystery. Gympie is a small city in Queensland, Australia, known for its mining history. In the 1860s, gold was found in the area, creating a gold rush that brought prospectors into the city. But miners weren't the only Europeans to settle in the area, as farmers also made homes for themselves here. the land had also long been the home of Aboriginal Australians. In 1966, a farmer named Dal Berry was working his field on the outskirts of Gympie when he found a strange object. At first, it looked like two large rocks, but on closer inspection, it seemed to have intricate carvings and somewhat resembled a very weathered statue of an ape. Berry didn't know what to make of the statue, but believed the two rocks had once been connected. The smaller piece was the head of the ape, so he cemented this on top of the larger piece. The Gympie ape was then donated to a local museum in the hopes that more could be uncovered about its origin. Apes are not native to Australia, so the ape had to have come from outside sources. A few proposals were put forward. One was that it had been carved by Chinese miners who'd come to the area long before Europeans learned of Australia. Other theories were even more fanciful, suggesting it might be of ancient Egyptian origin and resembled the Egyptian god Thoth. The fact that it was found near an even more mysterious location only made the Gympie ape even more intriguing. This location is known as the Gympie Pyramid. It was first officially discovered in 1975, although locals had known of the pyramid for far longer. The pyramid today lies in ruins and resembles 6 or 7 low terraces. Many stories have been told of the pyramids, including of supposedly mystical properties and people seeing apparitions in the area. While pseudo-historians have suggested it was built by Egyptians, South Americans, or travelers from India, the actual explanation is more mundane. It was a terraced farm created during the 1800s by European settlers. But with people continuing to spread stories about the supposedly mystical properties of the Gympie pyramids and their association with far-off lands, any artifact found nearby has gathered even more intrigue. Very little scientific research into the Gympie ape has been conducted. We know it's made from ironstone, but little other geological investigation has been done. It's also unknown when exactly the statue was created, or even where precisely it was found. This information could be used to determine its origin, whether it was made by early European settlers like the terraced pyramid, or was a more modern creation. A final theory is that the Gympie ape is nothing but a work of pareidolia. The statue is simply two rocks that, when put together, somewhat resembled an ape. Restoration work done by the farmer may have emphasized features that were created just from natural erosion. At first glance, this image seems to show two hunters standing on a hill, but closer inspection reveals they're actually standing on a mound of bison skulls, which brings into perspective the number of these animals that were hunted during the 19th century. This particular image was captured in Rougeville, Michigan in 1882, and after it was taken, it was estimated that only 456 bison remained alive on the US continent. Just 100 years earlier, the bison population numbered between 30 and 60 million. The tragic decline in their numbers started with the colonization of the West after the arrival of settlers on the continent. With them, they brought powerful weapons that could fell a bison in one fell swoop, and with very little effort. This gave rise to the bison hide and bone trade, which in turn resulted in more hunters seeking out these animals in hopes of turning a profit. Before long, entire herds were completely wiped out, and their numbers quickly started to dwindle. While this is certainly a tragedy, many experts state that the bison were not only hunted for food and trade, but for a far more sinister reason. Until the arrival of settlers on the continent, Native American tribes had fostered close relationships with these animals, which they considered an important resource for their own survival. As the number of bison started to decline, many of these tribes were left decimated, and they had no choice but to relocate to reservations that were under the control of settlers. Many historians suggest that this was no mere coincidence, but a carefully orchestrated plan to take control of these areas, which forced the rightful owners of the land into submission. Tribes that had relied on the bison in the past started faring far worse than those who hadn't, since they now had no way of acquiring food, clothing, shelter, or tools, which were often fashioned out of bones. Not only had they lost one of their most vital resources, but they were also forced to abandon the nomadic lifestyle that they were used to, since they were now forced to remain in reservations that had been established by the settlers. Unfortunately, no laws were put into place to curb the rate at which these animals were hunted, and their near extinction was only quickened by industry. Whenever a new railroad was being constructed, working men needed meat and leather, which were easily procured from the bison via high-powered firearms. In modern times, their numbers have started to climb thanks to conservation efforts, and yet the American bison is still considered to be near threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The USS Jacob Jones was the U.S. destroyer to be sunk by an enemy in the First World War. For over a century, the location of this historical wreck has remained a mystery. That mystery was finally solved in 2022. The Jacob Jones was launched in 1915, before the United States entered the war that was already ravaging Europe. But when the US declared war on Germany, the destroyer was sent across the Atlantic to help in the fighting. For much of 1917, she was patrolling the Irish Sea and escorting other ships across the waters. While the ship was fully equipped for attack, including depth charges specifically designed to combat submarines, the Jacob Jones was most well known for her efforts in rescuing the victims of other attacks. In July, the crew rescued 44 survivors of a U-boat attack on a British steamship. 2 weeks later, she rescued 26 of 28 men who'd been aboard another steamship sunk by a German submarine. One of her last heroics came in October of 1917, when she was escorting a group of steamers when a U-boat surfaced within the group. The submarine fired a torpedo at another one of the escorting ships. While others chased after the enemy submarine, the Jacob Jones stayed behind and rescued over 300 men from the sinking vessel. Just 2 months later, it was the crew of the Jacob Jones that needed to be rescued. It was the afternoon of December 6, 1917. The USS Jacob Jones had spent the day escorting troop ships to France and now sailing back to port. She was alone. At about 4:20 p.m., one of the crew members spotted a torpedo exiting the water. He called out and the captain tried to maneuver the ship in avoidance, but there was little that could be done. The ship was struck below the waterline and water started flooding in. The main mast was damaged and the ship didn't have power. There was no way to send an SOS message, and the crew of the Jacob Jones were on their own. Dozens of men entered the water. Even though it was only the mid-afternoon, it was already growing dark and the water was cold. To make matters worse, depth charges on board the ship detonated after the sinking, taking more lives and stunning some who were in the water. The submarine that had hit them was U-53, captained by Hans Rose. Rose ordered the submarine to surface a few miles from the scene and maneuver back. A few badly wounded Americans were taken aboard the German vessel before it disappeared back beneath the water. But Rose also sent a message to a nearby US base, letting them know of the sinking and where the stranded men could be found. Due to these actions, Allied vessels were able to locate the survivors. 38 men survived the sinking, but 66 were lost, including a man named Stanton F. Kalk, who had swam from boat to boat to ensure the vessels remained stable while they were awaiting rescue. USS Jacob Jones was sunk in a matter of minutes, and for a century, the exact location of its wreck was a mystery. It remained a major goal for divers dedicated to locating wrecks, due to its historical significance to the US and its allies. But there are many wrecks in the English Channel, and narrowing down which could be the sunken destroyer was a difficult task. In 2022, a group of divers from the DiveStar Wreck Exploration Team examined a number of these wrecks. On their second day of diving, they found one that matched the description of the Jacob Jones. It was located at a depth of 115 meters, not far from the Isle of Sicily. No human remains or personal items were collected, but signs on the ship confirmed that this was the missing vessel. In October 2024, 51-year-old Suzanne Simpson was living in San Antonio, Texas with her husband, Brad. They had 4 children together, and Suzanne was employed as a luxury real estate agent. On the 6th of October that year, Suzanne and Brad attended a birthday party at the Argyle in Alamo Heights, Texas. For most of the night, the party continued without incident, but at around 11 p.m., a witness saw the couple arguing and would later report that the fight got physical at one point. A neighbor would state that he heard screams coming from a nearby wooded area after learning that Suzanne had gone missing and could not be located. He added that during the argument, it became obvious that Suzanne was trying to get away from Brad, but he prevented her from leaving. At 3 p.m. the next day, the couple's children's school contacted Brad to report that Suzanne had not picked them up, and the authorities were notified. The lead investigator in her case then contacted Brad to set up a meeting about the case, but Brad failed to show up and then refused to cooperate with the police. After an appeal was made for anyone who saw Brad's black truck being driven in certain areas to come forward, several witnesses contacted the police to state that they'd seen him driving in different areas with large trash bags and a tarp in the back of a vehicle, the day after Suzanne disappeared. It was later reported when he traveled to the school to get his children, these items were no longer in the truck, and he'd removed a firewood rack from the truck's bed. Then he traveled to the bubble bath car wash, where he washed and cleaned the driver's side and left the rear passenger sides of the vehicle. In a surveillance photo, investigators spotted a 30-ounce bottle of Clorox, which is a cleaning product, on the back seat. Brad then texted a friend, asking him to meet up at his house and adding that he didn't have much time. The friend stated he'd be there in 40 minutes, and Brad then instructed him to leave unknown items in the pump house, making sure to mention a firearm that was also to be left behind. Later that night, the same friend texted Brad telling him to, quote, "get over here," and stating that he won't tell anyone. On the 8th of October, Brad was seen standing next to a fire pit, and when it was searched later on, investigators found a burnt laptop and 3 cell phones that had been destroyed by the fire. It's believed that the 3 phones belonged to Brad, and that he was attempting to get rid of evidence. While the search for Suzanne was ongoing, the last known photo of her, which was taken by a security camera, was released in hopes that someone had seen her, but no one came forward with any new information. With this evidence in hand, Brad was taken into custody the next day, and according to investigators, he seemed completely unfazed by his wife's disappearance and the fact that he was named as a suspect. He stated that Suzanne had lost her phone at an HEB store on the day of her disappearance, and that he had no idea where she was. Suzanne's banker then came forward to report that she'd made a strange statement to him. She said that if she ever went missing, the police should look for her in a lake, but she didn't elaborate on that statement, and the investigation into her case remains active, and Suzanne's current whereabouts remain unknown. Scientists trying to piece together the mysteries of human evolution made a major breakthrough with DNA analysis of a skull found in China almost 100 years ago. The skull was given the nickname the Dragon Man when it was finally brought to the attention of scientists some 90 years after it was found by construction workers building a bridge over China's Shaohua River. The fossil puzzled experts, but DNA evidence helped solve the mystery of the skull, and a much older mystery that scientists have been trying to solve for decades. A farming family brought the skull to a university in 2018. They've been keeping it hidden for 3 generations. In 1933, while China was under Japanese control, workers building a bridge in Harbin uncovered the skull. They knew that they were looking at something special. It was unlike any modern human skull. To keep it safe, one of the workers took it home and left it at the bottom of the family well, where it would remain until the family finally retrieved it in 2018. A well-preserved 146,000-year-old skull was found, its origin identified by soil analysis. The skull, with a long, low brain cap, large nose, and almost square eye sockets, belonged to a man with a brain comparable to modern humans. Scientists considered it a new species, Homo longi, or Dragon Man, named after the Black Dragon River region. Others were unsure, given the muddle in the middle period, when 3 human species interbred, making classification difficult without DNA. Another theory was that this was the skull of a Denisovan. The Denisovans were a human species that were only identified in 2018. So far, only fragments of remains had been found, and it was only through genetic sequencing that scientists were sure the species was distinct from others. If the skull were a Denisovan, it would mark one of the biggest discoveries related to the species. DNA testing would be needed to find the answer. Unfortunately, testing of bone and tooth fragments didn't reveal any ancient DNA that could be tested. Scientists took a new approach, scraping plaque from the Dragon Man's mouth to analyze. Most of the DNA found was identified as modern contamination, but there was enough ancient DNA to test. The tests revealed that the skull most closely matched DNA from the fragments of Denisovan fossils. The Dragon Man was what this ancient human species looked like, beyond a few teeth and bone fragments. History is full of ancient cities that have been lost to the sands of time. Some of these are only attested to in a few written sources, while others are widely known until only relatively recently, before vanishing without a trace. There are few lost cities as important as the ancient city of Akkad. The Akkadian Empire has been described as the first empire in human history. It was founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BC. For thousands of years, the region known as Sumer had been populated by city-states. Some of these could be very powerful, but their influence was limited to the city and the area immediately surrounding it. Sargon defeated the king of one of these city-states, but rather than staying in one location, he expanded his influence to spread across what had once been many independent states. The Akkadian Empire grew during the reigns of Sargon's son and grandson, unifying huge stretches of Mesopotamia. The empire stretched from the Mediterranean to Iran and from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. For the most part, however, it remained between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the two rivers that had made Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization. Sargon is believed to have founded the city of Akkad, the same city that the empire will be named after. It's been attested to in many ancient sources and was clearly an important city for both politics and trade. Descriptions of the city often include mentions of a port or quay, which was very important for transporting goods into the city, as well as transporting armies to the battlefields across the known world. This allowed the Akkadians to expand their influence and to keep the territory under their own control. There was also a significant temple to Ishtar. In the past, a god might have been the patron of a single city. Sargon made Ishtar the deity of his dynasty, making her an important god to the entire temple. Even after the Akkadian Empire fell, its impact was felt by the successor states. The Akkadian kings were glorified and held as what a good king should be like. The city of Akkad itself was also prized even after it was abandoned. Long after the empire fell, a Babylonian king wrote about excavating an old temple at Akkad and restoring it. They believed the Akkadian Empire was so important that it should never be forgotten. But it eventually was, and it wasn't until the 1800s that archaeologists began to understand the significance of this ancient empire. At first, they believed the city of Akkad would be fairly easy to find. But despite over 140 years of searching, no trace of the city has ever been found. A few solutions have been put forward to try to solve the mystery. Some have suggested that Akkad was another name for Babylon, but multiple ancient writers spoke about Babylon and Akkad in the same accounts, making it unlikely they were referring to the same place by two different names. The description of the city's quay has indicated to some that it was located along one of the rivers, and was likely at a confluence between two river points. But others believe that the city instead had extensive canal systems that would have connected to the rivers, but regulated the water flow. Despite these clues, the location remains a mystery. This photo shows 38-year-old plant mechanic Greg Monks while he was attending a stag party in Portugal in June of 2025, and it's clear that he's having a good time. But this is the last time that he was seen alive, and the investigation into his case is still ongoing. Greg hailed from Scotland, and on the 28th of May, he and a group of friends traveled to Portugal, where they checked into the Nova Choro apartments. From there, they planned to visit several bars in the area to celebrate a friend's upcoming wedding. They were supposed to remain in Portugal for 5 days, but just hours after setting out from the apartments, something went wrong. The group had been out for a few hours, having drinks and food, and at some point in the early morning hours, Greg decided to head back to his apartment. He bid his friends goodnight and started back on his own, but when they tried to rouse him the next morning, they were surprised to find he wasn't in his room. The police and Greg's family were informed, and it was later revealed that he was last seen on CCTV footage in a quiet residential area about 4 miles from the apartments. Searches of that area were immediately organized, and his family and girlfriend flew out to Portugal to assist. The last image of Greg was spread far and wide in hopes that someone had seen him and that they could point the police in the right direction, but no such information was received. His friends stated that they last saw Greg while they were having drinks in the King's Cross karaoke bar, from where he decided to walk back to his accommodation. It was speculated that he got lost along the way and was unable to find his way back, but his continued absence became a major cause for concern. The group of friends eventually traveled back to Scotland without locating Greg, but the authorities in Portugal continued searching for him. The police asked that anyone with CCTV footage of Greg contact them, and this resulted in the first major clue. A man living in a luxury villa in an area of scrubland responded and stated that they should search the nearby hillside. Sniffer dogs were brought in and immediately led searchers to an area in the scrubland. Tragically, Greg's family was informed that he'd been found deceased. His remains were recovered, and after an autopsy was performed, the events of that morning became much clearer. It was established that after he left the karaoke bar, Greg became disoriented and lost. He then walked to the area where he was eventually found, where he slipped and fell into a ravine, losing his life in the process. Greg's family accepted this outcome, and they've stated that they don't suspect foul play to be involved, though they are struggling to come to terms with the tragic series of events that claimed his life. During the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of pieces of art were stolen by the Third Reich or their sympathizers, mostly from Jewish people or others who were targeted by the regime. After the war, many of these paintings were recovered and returned to their rightful owners, but many more disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. In August of 2025, one of these missing paintings reappeared in an unexpected place. Jacques Goudsticker was a Dutch art dealer living in Amsterdam in 1940. After the Netherlands were invaded by Germany, he helped other Jewish people escape before trying to escape himself. Unfortunately, he fell into the hold of a cargo vessel that was supposed to take him to safety, but the incident cost him his life. After he passed, his vast art collection was sold under duress to German government officials. Thousands of paintings were looted. Among those was a portrait of Contessa Caglione, also known as Portrait of a Lady. This was a piece of art by the Italian master Giuseppe Gislandi and dated back to the 18th century. Despite recovering parts of Goudsticker's looted collection, Portrait of a Lady remained missing. In the 1990s, Goudsticker's daughter-in-law and a Dutch newspaper campaigned to find it. Documents revealed the painting might have been with Friedrich Kajian, a German official who funded the war by selling stolen Jewish items. After the war, Kajian fled to Argentina, where he had 2 daughters. Though his daughters were uncooperative, a reporter noticed one was selling her home. Photos on the real estate website showed Portrait of a Lady hanging in her living room. Investigators were certain this was the missing painting. It matched photos of the painting, and they claimed there was no reason why anyone would want to forge it. It wasn't a particularly famous painting, and Gislandi's paintings typically sold for only a few $1,000s each. Local authorities were informed of the discovery, but when they raided the home, they found the painting was replaced with a more innocent work of art. But finally, in the first days of September of 2025, Kajian's daughter produced the artwork. She'd always said she didn't know what painting the investigators were talking about, but now it was obvious she not only had the painting, but knew that it was something that others had been looking for. Portrait of a Lady might not be the only looted artwork that Kajian's daughters inherited from their father. A still life work by Abraham Mignon was seen in the background of a social media post by his second daughter. This painting still hasn't been recovered, and just how many paintings Kajian left Europe with and how many remain in his family's possession remains a mystery. James IV of Scotland was the last monarch to lose his life in battle in Britain. He fell in the Battle of Flodden in 1513, leading his army in an attack against the English. But what happened to his body after this battle is a curious story that ended in a mystery. James had been crowned King of Scotland when he was just a teenager. He was popular within his own kingdom and was known as a Renaissance king. He had ambitions to sponsor the arts and sciences, and also to lead a new crusade. But like many of the kings of Scotland before him, the primary focus of his foreign policy was England. Scotland and England had a typical rocky relationship early in James's reign. He supported a pretender to the throne during the reign of Henry VII, but eventually came around to support him. He was married to Henry's daughter, Margaret, the sister of the future King Henry VIII. With his marriage to Margaret came the signing of a peace between Scotland and England that was supposed to last in perpetuity. But when England went to war with France, Scotland had a choice to make. Scotland and France have been allies since the 1200s, specifically due to their shared enemy of England. So when Henry VIII went to war against the French monarch, Scotland decided to side with its old ally. James wrote a letter to Henry, warning him that if he went to war, he would face a threat from his northern neighbor. Henry ignored this threat and went to war anyway. James personally led the Scottish army to war in the north of England. He had the numerical advantage, but the place chosen to field the Battle of Flodden wasn't the best for the northern monarch. James lost his life in the fight, along with many other Scottish nobles. James's body was taken to London, where it was collected by Catherine of Aragon. She sent James's surcoat to Henry, who was in France, and suggested it might be turned into a war banner, but the question of what to do with the body was more difficult. James had been excommunicated by the Pope, who was an ally of England at the time. He couldn't be buried in consecrated grounds. The Pope eventually sent permission for James to be buried at St. Paul's Cathedral, but for some reason this never happened. James's coffin was left above ground in a priory in Sheen, an area that's now part of Western London. According to a popular story, James's head was later removed by workmen and kept as a trophy by the master glazier of Elizabeth I. When he decided to get rid of it, he took it to Great St. Michael's Church in Wood Street, another London church. There, the head was left in a charnel pit, a place for stray bones and crypt sweepings. The church building was burned down in the Great Fire of London, and its replacement was destroyed during the Blitz. Today, a pub is believed to stand on the site of the old charnel pit, named the Red Herring. As for the rest of James's body, that also remains a mystery. The Sheen Priory was dissolved during the English Reformation, and it's not known what happened to the remains that were buried there. All that's known for certain is that this was a place where James's body was last seen. The location is now a golf course. Some have suggested an excavation to try to locate the king's missing remains, but without clear information about where exactly the gravesite once was, it's unlikely they will ever be found. This photo shows Phineas Gage holding the metal tamping rod involved in a horrific accident that changed his life. Born in New Hampshire, Gage worked as a construction foreman for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. His job involved using explosives to remove rock, which required drilling a hole, adding gunpowder, placing a layer of sand, and then compacting the charge with the tamping rod before ignition. On September 13, 1848, near Cavendish, Vermont, Gage forgot the layer of sand. When he compacted the explosive, the rod struck the rock, prematurely igniting the powder. His coworkers would find him conscious nearby. They soon realized the 3.58-foot rod had traveled through his skull, entering below his cheekbone and exiting the top of his head. But somehow, miraculously, he survived and was discharged. But Gabe was a changed man, rude, unprofessional, and restless. He left the railroad, moving to Chile to work as a stagecoach driver, and later to California. He began suffering from epileptic seizures, and he would pass away 12 years after the injury. This photo is the only known image of Gage, and the tamping rod is displayed at Harvard Medical School's Warren Anatomical Museum. In 1337, a priest named John Ford was attacked in broad daylight in a busy London street. The person who orchestrated the attack was never punished, but even if a jury was confident they knew who was behind the attack, historians have remained baffled about why the attack happened. New research and a newly uncovered letter have revealed the truth. The attack on Ford was seen as a major crime. Witnesses watched another priest stop Ford and distract him with conversations before 3 other men ambushed him. Ford was struck by a blade in the stomach and throat, then left to lose his life in the street. The attackers didn't do much to hide their identities, and witnesses were able to name one of the men as Hugh Lavelle, a man from a powerful noble family, and the others were recognized as former servants of Lavelle's sister, Ayla Fitzpaine. Fitzpaine was a very powerful woman. She was married to Robert Fitzpaine, a baron in Dorset. Ford had actually served in a church on the Fitzpaine estate and had once been close to the couple, but years earlier there'd been a falling out. A jury was brought together to investigate the crime. Even though the identities of the attackers were known, nobody knew who they were, and little effort was made to find them. Only one person was ever punished for the crime, one of the servants, who served 5 years in prison. At the time, the jury would have known that it was likely Fitzpaine who was behind the attack, but no effort was made to confiscate any of her possessions, and she continued to live happily without any trouble. To historians looking back at the records, it was obvious Fitzpaine's wealth and power meant she had avoided justice. But the mystery was why she would want to commit such a crime in the first place. A letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury about Fitzpaine was the first clue in the case. The Archbishop wrote about how he'd heard stories about the noblewoman. She'd conducted extramarital affairs with numerous men, including knights and clergymen. The only person who was actually named, though, was John Ford. Fitzpaine had confessed to some of the cases, and the Archbishop had determined she was guilty in others too. As punishment, she was ordered to conduct a humiliating walk of shame, walking barefoot across Salisbury Cathedral, carrying a heavy candle once a year for 7 years. She was also ordered not to wear jewelry or makeup and to donate money to various charities. Fitzpaine's failure to punish Ford, despite the Archbishop's displeasure, puzzled historians. They suspected Ford might have informed the church, providing a motive for a later attack. But the Archbishop's extraordinary focus on the case and the Fitzpaines' seemingly untroubled marriage after the affair raised further concerns. Another question revealed that Fitzpaines ran a criminal organization, including Ford. They had attacked a French priory, stealing goods and holding them for ransom, a crime more likely to grab the church's attention. And this also explained the public attack on Ford, likely a message from the gang to deter other informants. In 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz became the first known person to circumnavigate Africa. The explorer opened up a route that would become one of the most important trade routes in the world. But according to one story, he may have been beaten to this accomplishment by more than 2,000 years. Around the year 600 BC, a group of Phoenician sailors set off from Egypt's Red Sea coast, sailing south and into the unknown. They'd been commissioned by Pharaoh Niko II, who ruled Egypt from 610 to 595 BC. Niko was known for having a large imagination and a lot of ambition, as well as various military campaigns against the Babylonians. He started work on the construction of a canal connecting the Red Sea to the Nile. He abandoned this project when he realized that it would be as much help to his enemies as it was to him, but his mind remained on the ocean. It's known that Niko constructed fleets at a time when Egypt wasn't known for its seafaring abilities. But when it came to an ambitious project to circumnavigate Africa, he decided to work with more experienced people. The Phoenicians were the best mariners of the ancient world. They also had a common enemy with Egypt and Babylonia, making it more likely they would work with the pharaoh. They were instructed to leave Egypt through the Red Sea and return via the Straits of Gibraltar. It was a mission that had never been done before. Nobody in the ancient Mediterranean world knew whether it was even possible. Many believed that Africa connected with Asia somewhere in the south, and that the Indian and Atlantic Oceans weren't connected, but the expedition went ahead. 3 years later, the Phoenicians sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules, as it was known in the ancient times. They brought with them strange stories and proof that Africa was surrounded by water. Unfortunately, the entire adventure is recorded in only one source, Herodotus's Histories. Herodotus was an ancient Greek historian, writing roughly 100 years after the expedition was believed to have taken place. His famous work is one of the most useful sources we have about the ancient world, but it cannot be entirely trusted. Herodotus was known to write down any of the stories passed to him that he found particularly interesting. They didn't have to have a huge amount of evidence to prove that they were true, and he did not always cross-reference his information with other sources. That means that a lot of the stories told in the histories are unlikely to be true. For some historians, Niko's expedition is one of the stories that is more fiction than fact. They point out that there was nothing to be gained by making the circumnavigation, and it was unlike ancient Egyptians to explore for the sake of curiosity alone. They also point out that other ancient writers didn't seem to have heard of the expedition. Chroniclers, writing centuries later, claimed they had no way of knowing what the south of Africa was like, and that information could only come from future explorers. But not everybody has these doubts. Herodotus included some unusual details. The most important of these was that the sailors reported that the sun was seen to the north of them as they sailed west. Herodotus didn't believe this, and it would have seemed impossible to ancient people who had no knowledge of the southern hemisphere. The fact that Herodotus didn't believe it, but chose to include this detail, is revealing itself. But that it lines up with what actually happens after sailing below the tropics makes some historians believe that the Phoenicians actually saw this. If the Phoenician expedition really did take place, the main mystery is why we have no other records of this grand achievement. No monuments mention it, and no contemporary sources include any descriptions. It's possible these may be hidden, waiting to be found by future archaeologists, solving the mystery of whether this voyage ever actually happened once and for all. This photo looks like a still from a Hollywood movie created through special effects, but nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, it shows the 2010 eruption of a volcano in Iceland against the backdrop of a borealis, which is a strange light display caused by charged particles from the sun that collide with gases in our atmosphere. The mountain seen in this photo is called Eyjafjallajökull, which in that year had started exhibiting seismic activity. In March, the first eruption occurred on the northeast flank of the mountain, and at first it seemed as though it would be unremarkable, but in April, it became apparent that the event would become much larger than expected when further eruptions started in the center of the volcano, which contained a 1.8-mile wide crater that contained a lot of ice. As the mountains started to heat up, the ice started to melt and it flowed into the volcano, eventually reaching the magma beneath the Earth's crust. This resulted in the formation of massive amounts of steam and ash that were then ejected from the mountain at massive speeds. The ash that was sent high into the atmosphere then entered a jet stream that carried it across several countries, including Norway, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Great Britain. As a result, airplanes were grounded, and the Icelandic government declared a state of emergency. The rest of Europe followed suit, and air travel came to a complete standstill. Every day that went by cost airlines as much as $171 million in revenue, but many other sectors were also affected. Passengers were left stranded in foreign countries, and calls were made for the National Center of Atmospheric Science to map the course of the ash plume, which contained particles of volcanic rock that could cause serious damage to aircraft. 2 research planes were sent to the area, and using sophisticated instruments and computer models, the ash plume's course was tracked. But efforts were also being made to reduce the amount of ash in the atmosphere. A research plane owned by the Facility for Airborne Atmospheric Measurements was sent to the affected areas after being fitted with an instrument that reduced the number of particles using a laser. The plane flew above the ash plume and fired the laser downward, and on the ground, researchers created a map of the plume using computer models. It was found that the plume contained electrically conductive particles that could result in lightning. This is known as St. Elmo's fire, a phenomenon that's been seen many times, and which, as described by witnesses, causes certain parts of an airplane to start glowing. But far more concerning is the fact that it can affect the plane's airspeed indicator, which is an essential part of any aircraft. Furthermore, if the ash were to enter the airplane's engines, it caused them to seize up completely, rendering the plane immobile and sending it crashing to the ground below. As a result, more than 104,000 flights were canceled in different areas, 95,000 of which were in Europe alone. This is considered to be the biggest air travel disruption to occur since the Second World War. Today, scientists continue their studies into the prediction of the eruption of volcanoes, but in many cases, they occur without warning, causing widespread disruptions and damage. Referred to as the gentle giants of history, the Tunit, or Dorset people, are quite the mystery. Not only were they unusually tall and intimidating, but they were shy and certainly peculiar. Although we know much about their Paleo-Eskimo culture, what we don't know is where they came from and where they went. In their wake, the Tunit would leave behind perplexing enigmas that, despite significant research, have been left unsolved. Inuit legends recounted their encounters with the Tunit, regarded as the first inhabitants of the Arctic region, appearing long before the ancestors of the Inuit culture. According to the passed-down legends, the Tunit were giants, far stronger, enough to crush the neck of a walrus and drag its body to the campsite, and far taller than those that they encountered. On average, men would tower 6 feet, while women were 5 feet 9 inches, a significant difference compared to other inhabitants of the area, who were a median height of 5 feet and 4 inches tall for men and 5 feet for women. In addition to being tall and strong, stories speak of alleged powerful magic that the group was said to possess. The Tunit people dominated the Canadian Arctic and Greenland early on, though their exact emergence is unconfirmed. Some believe that the culture arose from an even earlier group, with almost no outside influence. According to history, this race of shy yet formidable people dominated the mythology of the Inuit. It was said that although they were nice, if you were to cross paths with one of them in a negative way, these giant beings would come after them or simply tell you to leave. Often, the indigenous groups would heed this warning. This peculiar group was recognized as being highly skilled and innovative. Research suggests that they knew how to spin yarn, which of course goes against the consensus that it was Viking settlers who taught this skill to the Inuits. Serving as an example of their incredibly artistic skills are the several carvings of humans and animals that they left behind. They were a highly decorative society, with even the harpoon heads being artistically made. Depending on the elders at the time of their co-inhabitants, the stories of the Tunit would change, specifically with adaptations to their behavior. Certain passed-down legends stated a peaceful existence, while others suggested conflict. But it seemed that this may not have been the case, according to one agreed characteristic of this culture: their shyness. Several indigenous groups claimed that if and when they did encounter the Tunit, they would simply hide away or run in fear. It was obvious that they were reluctant to interact with anyone from the outside world. If they were slain by other groups that lived alongside them, then what happened? Some could assume that they were bred to extinction. Intermingling with other tribes set them on the path to non-existence. But here's where another mystery surfaces. The Tunit people shared no genetic or cultural connection with the Inuit people who displaced them. So where did they go? It was just 2 years shy of the First World War when the Proteus class, a group of ships, would be launched. These were 4 vessels introduced into the American Navy with the purpose of being colliers. They were specifically designed for one purpose: coal transportation. Of course, this was the era of coal power, which made the combustible material very important. Within the fleet were the Proteus, Cyclops, Nereus, and Jupiter, each of which extended 542 feet long. They were immense vessels, just a couple of feet shorter than the German battleship known as the Bismarck. The ships were so large that they needed to be manned by at least 240 sailors each, with large holds running their full length, which makes the mystery associated with them all the more bizarre. Within the group of 4 colliers, 3 of them would enigmatically vanish, never to be seen again, making for a truly eerie mystery. Jupiter, the only ship that didn't vanish, was converted into an American aircraft carrier in 1920 and was sunk by a Japanese aircraft while in service. From the end of the First World War until 2 years into the Second, the remaining 3 vessels would begin their voyages into the void. Many know of the story of what happened to the USS Cyclops. Its ill-fated journey began on the 16th of February, 1918, when it left the port of Rio de Janeiro, bound for Salvador, Brazil. From the very start of the trip, though, things were going wrong, and it began with a cracked cylinder and overloading. Nonetheless, the vessel made its voyage to Salvador and was deported there to Baltimore, Maryland, where it would undergo repairs. It was due to make no stops in between these two locations. Cyclops, though, was far too unstable and needed to make a stop anyway. It stopped in Barbados and departed later. The ship continued its route to Baltimore, but would never make landfall. That stop in Barbados was the last time that anyone would ever see the vessel or its crew. No debris nor remains of the 309 crew members on board were found. Several theories made their way into the legend of the famous disappearance, and it quickly became associated with the eeriness that surrounded the Bermuda Triangle. But the USS Cyclops wasn't the only Proteus-class collier to have enigmatically vanished, an aspect often overlooked in the story. It seemed that the group of vessels was ill-fated since their launch. Walking in the outback of Australia is a harrowing venture on its own. Dangers lurk under every rock, concealed in every other bush, or waiting patiently to attack from above. Venomous snakes, aggressive spiders, opportunistic dingoes, and saltwater crocodiles. But what one wouldn't expect to be stalking them in the darkness is a strange glowing orb known as the minmin lights. There are various descriptions of them, from disembodied lights to stars on the ground. Sometimes they're blue, other times yellow or even white. But one characteristic remains consistent: they follow. Located in Boulia, Queensland, is a sign revealing the mystery to any traveler, hoping that they'll be less frightened, citing that while they've been approached, these glowing orbs have never been identified. Visitors are all given a similar warning: beware the ghosts of the outback. Along the dusty roads they appear, following and overtaking the unsuspecting traveler, always just out of reach. This bizarre phenomenon has been described as ethereal, as the glowing dots seemingly beckon their victims into the darkness. The first documented sighting of the personified objects came as early as 1918, when a stockman reported spotting the peculiar occurrence. Since then, hundreds upon hundreds of sightings have been reported, and many have shared their personal encounters over the years, only adding to the creepiness of the outback. Station supervisor at Cloncurry Railway Station, Matthew Curo, once came up close and personal with the luminescence back in '97. He thought it looked like a star on the ground and managed to get very close to it. For 45 minutes, the light lingered, allowing him to interact with this entity, which he claimed was sentient, even reacting to some loud noises. Curo even had to write a report of the exchange for work in case it became necessary later. But that report would only add to the heaps of documents suggesting similar encounters. There are several theories that have tried to explain what the minmin lights may be, from aliens that never arrive to ghosts of Aboriginal ancestors. Some say it's nothing more than a mirage or a hallucination, while others suggest a sentient force. They were a non-specific ethnic group, the Kugo, nor did they have any religious affiliation. They spoke the same language as their middle-aged neighbors and even practiced their culture. Despite fitting in, though, they were marginalized, viewed as inferior, and even segregated. They had to use different doors to enter the churches, and when receiving communion, the wafers would be thrown at them. Sometimes, if the sympathetic priest was present, they'd be offered their wafer on the tip of a wooden spoon. The surviving documents relating to these people only beg the question, what was wrong with them? The Kugo were so very common during the Pyrenees, yet they were despised and forced to live in segregated communities known as kugoteries, restricted from trade, taverns, and cabarets. They couldn't sell food or wine, touch market products, work with livestock, or use the public fountains, and it was forbidden for any non-Kugo to marry a Kugo. To mark the untouchables, a badge featuring the foot of a duck or a goose was used. This announced that there was something different about them. But what even were the Kugo? There are several theories that have tried to explain the reason behind the segregation and why no one dares touch these people, and what distinguishes them from the rest. Some believe that they descended from sufferers of leprosy or the mentally or physically impaired. None of the existing documents, though, describe the kugo as being sickly. In fact, the existing documents didn't mention a single reason as to why they would be ostracized. They just were. Other theories about their origins suggest that they were descendants of biblical beings, or supposed legendary figures, that were cursed by God. Unconfirmed ties to the Cathars and Visigoths were also investigated. Historical records gave rise to the speculation that the kugo were the first to become Christian within their areas. In these areas, each description differed from the last. Some described them as blonde-haired and blue-eyed, while others described them as having dark complexions. So it seemed that they still looked like their neighbors. They had varying hair shades, varying eye colors, and different skin types, allowing some to assume that the kugo didn't belong to just one race or culture. Comparing the records, documentation, and oral histories of this bizarre group, historians could only find two differences. For reasons unknown, the enigmatic people felt compelled to wear footwear during a time in which many were barefoot. But most bizarre of all, and certainly the creepiest, was that a few of the descriptions that ever surfaced suggested that the kugo had no earlobes. The first chance they got, the kugo would flee to America, leaving a life of bigotry behind. Eventually, as the centuries drew on, they became more and more assimilated into a society, where they would be forgotten but accepted. There exists no confirmed record for the kugo's origins, or why they were considered to be so incredibly different that they were ostracized and abused. They remain a strange historical enigma. Jim Leach and Harold Burgess were collectively known as Jim and Budge in the Northern Pennine caving group. The two were almost inseparable. They would spend much of their time together and even shared a common hobby, exploring underground caves. That was until their adventures were abruptly interrupted by the 6-year-long Second World War and its duties. When it was over, though, in 1947, the two decided to rekindle their friendship and their caving activities. Their first exploration since the war was set for the 24th of August. They decided that the Yorkshire Dales National Park was in great need of an expedition. On that day, Jim and Budge headed to Trogill Valley inside the national park, located at the very base of Ingleborough Mountain. It was around 12:30 that afternoon when the cavers discovered a small hole, partially obscured by stones. After removing most of them, the entrance was made bigger, enough to allow Jim to squeeze on down. He climbed down the unexplored hole when he came across a pair of shoes. It was certainly strange that a pair of shoes had found its way into this small opening, but as Jim's eyes traveled, he realized that they were connected to something. First, he saw the skull, and then the rest of the skeleton. The disembodied footwear now had an owner. After assessing this truly startling discovery further, he discovered that the body was lying beneath a large stone, which didn't appear to be crushing the skeleton. Located near the remains was a small bottle of white powder, which Jim initially mistook for flash powder, a substance used for fire making. Once out of the narrow cave, Jim described his find to Budge, and the two decided to head back to Clapham Village, located nearby. They found the police department and reported their discovery. Later that afternoon, they would be guiding Sergeant Knock to the scene. A guard was placed outside the entrance while they awaited a crime scene photographer to arrive. After some pictures were taken, the body was removed from the crevice for further analysis. The remains found their way to Skipton Mortuary, while the other items were sent to a Wakefield laboratory. At the mortuary, an examination revealed that the skeleton belonged to a male who was around 5 feet tall and aged somewhere between 22 and 30 years old. It's believed that the demise occurred no more than 6 years before its discovery. Forensic analysis determined he was wearing a blue shirt and a tie, as well as a suit with red and white stripes. He also had a tweedy overcoat and a trilby hat. Over at the Wakefield laboratory, far stranger discoveries were being made. In his possession were several coins, none newer than 1939, which added up to 11 shillings and 5 halfpence. In this unknown man's possession were several other items, from shaving tubes and a toothbrush to a box of matches and a propelling pencil. Additionally, the glass bottle that Jim had seen was not flash powder, but rather cyanide, a very lethal poison. But the bottle itself was full. Another ampule of the same poison was also found, but it was unbroken. One lab worker, Lewis Nichols, suggested that this kind of poison was often used for vermin, but he hadn't seen one like this design before. So the mystery was passed along to legal historian A.W.B. Simpson, who revealed something truly shocking. He noted that the only known users of an ampule such as these were spies who were working in enemy territory. The vial of poison acted as an assurance should the spy be discovered. Simpson believed that in some way this man was connected to the German Secret Service, but his claims aren't supported by German documents that were discovered post-war. The skeleton in Trogil brought several families forward. In desperation to finding missing loved ones, they claimed that the remains were those of relatives or acquaintances who had gone missing. Exhaustive efforts ruled out possible identifications, leaving behind a sinister mystery. It was 1922 when Dolny Vestonice, an Upper Paleolithic site, was unearthed. Archaeologists had stumbled upon it in the modern town of Brno, located in Moravia, in the eastern part of the Czech Republic. Through radiocarbon dating, experts were able to determine that the site existed approximately 30,000 years ago. It would be this very discovery that allowed historians and archaeologists to learn a significant amount of information about the Upper Paleolithic. Numerous remains, artifacts, and dwellings were discovered here, offering a unique insight into prehistoric life. Among the ceramic figurines, early forms of pottery and huts were something that no one could have prepared for. Through excavation efforts, researchers would discover several burials that had taken place, but one of them was particularly unnerving. That discovery became known as the triple burial of Dolny Vestonice. The site was subjected to two excavations, one of which occurred in 1922 and the other in 1980, during which a mystery arose. Submerged in the dirt that was meticulously dusted away were the skeletal remains of three individuals, placed side by side in a mysterious way. As soon as the remains were fully visible, an expert was summoned to the site, hoping for any explanation as to what they were seeing. Lying in the center of the three was the skeleton of a woman, and the other two alongside her were men. In-depth analysis would reveal that the female's spine was curved, and she was host to several other skeletal anomalies. Experts believe that she may have been disabled in her life. In contrast to her ailing health, the two other figures were in perfect condition, seemingly having passed in the prime of their lives. But their burials were also incredibly unusual, making this find especially unique and different from the others that archaeologists had unearthed there. One individual was lying on his back, and his head was facing towards the woman. His hand, covered in red ochre, was placed over her abdomen or pelvis. The second male figure was lying on his stomach and facing away from the woman. Curiously, his arm was linked with hers. Both men wore necklaces of canine teeth and had ivory on their heads. One of the men was also found to be wearing a strange painted mask. The same red ochre that stained the one figure's hand was also found smeared across each of their heads. It was certainly a strange find, one that would leave archaeologists and historians scratching their heads. What could all of this mean, and why weren't there more like them? There are several interpretations of the triple burial, none of which have been confirmed with any certainty. It's been suggested that the woman had met her demise in childbirth, with the mask-wearing man being a medical practitioner, and the other being her husband. It's thought that both of these men were responsible for the woman's early demise, and therefore they likely followed her into the afterlife. Wandering the streets of Jacksonville, Illinois, was a young man who couldn't identify his relatives or where he had come from. On the 11th of October, 1945, the day he first disappeared, the man would refer to himself as Lewis, but he couldn't speak very well and instead scribbled his name on a piece of paper. This was due to his inability to hear. With no proper identification, authorities would name him John Doe number 24. Because of his disability, Lewis would be sent to several institutions littered across Illinois, where he would be poorly treated by staff, possibly causing his later blindness. During his stay at this institution, he was legally referred to as John Doe 24, until it was changed in 1978 to John Doe Boyd, a whole 33 years later. This would allow him to apply for Social Security benefits. John Doe 24, John Doe Boyd, and Lewis weren't the only names associated with this mystery. Upon the initial discovery of the young man, he wore a vest with the name George Dunkley on it. Possibly this may have been his name, though no missing person reports were made with this title, which led some to consider that it was a hand-me-down or purchased second-hand from a man named George Dunkley. But the mystery only deepens when the name is finally linked to a real person. On the 5th of April in 1945, the very year that Lewis was found, a passing in Jacksonville, Illinois was documented. The individual was a man named George Bison Dunkley, and he was 68 years old. Some suggested the vest may have come from him. Without a confirmed identity, Lewis was forced to linger in the facilities. Although he was subjected to unkindness, he remained kind and displayed a bubbly personality. He would often provide entertainment for the other patients by putting on small performances in jazz bars or circuses. He was also said to enjoy dancing. Lewis haunted the homes with a bag, which he used to collect glasses, rings, and silverware. The unidentified man was well liked by others, who believed he was far more intelligent than the staff gave him credit for. Without faltering, Lewis would responsibly carry out any task that was assigned to him. Although he was placed in these homes, where he was named, clothed, fed, and forgotten, mystery still lingered around Lewis. Who was he? Where did he come from? And what was his connection to George Dunkley? To the eastern Kuku-Yalanji people, Kalkajaka is a sacred battlefield of spirits and clans, but to tourists, Black Mountain is an eerie landform shrouded in mystery and legend. Nestled in the Kalkajaka National Park in Queensland is an imposing mountain range made up of formidable black granite boulders, some of which are the size of a house. These boulders stack dangerously on top of one another, seemingly defying all logic. But it's not their disobedience towards gravity that makes the Black Mountain so mysterious, but rather its association with inexplicable disappearances. Kalkajaka finds itself being mentioned synonymously with the Bermuda Triangle, since it acts as the inexplicable region, the only difference being its location. Climbing the mountain is discouraged, and for good reason. The warnings came from several Aboriginal groups, and elders have told visitors that climbing the site is asking for trouble, and that those who stray from the advice may never be seen again. Of course, not everyone heeded these warnings. According to the locals, several disappearances have been linked to the area, from gold miners and police to bushrangers and farmers. People weren't the only ones vanishing here either. In 1877, a farmer headed to the mountain on horseback in search of a calf that had escaped. When he failed to return, a search party was sent after him. No trace of him, the horse, or the calf was ever found. In 1882, two farmers scoured the area in search of their missing herd of cattle. They clambered up the boulders and attempted to navigate the labyrinths they formed. Allegedly, they were never seen again. Notorious outlaw Sugarfoot Jack and his accomplices fled to Black Mountain following an exchange of bullets. Neither he nor his band of outcasts were ever seen again. No bodies were found either. In 2001, one of the very few who ventured into the Kalkajaka lived to tell its tale. A man named Ivan, along with a friend named Danny, decided to camp below the eerie land formation while journeying to a different location. While setting up, though, they noticed an unusual and certainly uncomfortable amount of silence. They would later be woken by the sound of crumbling rocks and footsteps that drew nearer and nearer. Rushing with adrenaline, Danny ran from the tent in an effort to scare off whoever was out there. Fearing for his friend, Ivan followed him, and they both stood in the presence of something truly bizarre. A black mass allegedly floated toward them before dissipating. They packed up their things and left, never looking back. Haiti was home to Clervius Narcisse since his birth in 1922. Not much is known about his history, aside from the city in which he lived, Leicester, and that he had a large family. On the 30th of April in 1962, 40-year-old Clervius found himself falling inexplicably ill. He had a fever and was allegedly spewing vital fluid. Concerned for his life, he headed to the Schweitzer Hospital, operated by all-American staff, but none of the doctors could determine the source of his symptoms. Without a diagnosis, medicating him was made impossible. Gradually, Clairvius' condition worsened, and 3 days after his arrival at the hospital, he passed away. After being pronounced deceased, with the helpless doctor's recording of unexplained respiratory failure as his COD, his body was rolled into a cold storage locker, where he would remain for a whole day before his burial. On the 3rd of May, 1962, the body of Clairvius was buried, but ominously, it wouldn't stay that way. The word zombie is one that evokes a terrifying image within the collective imagination, as it should. But what many don't know is that the narrative has roots in Haitian culture. It was 1980, 18 years after the passing of Clairvius, when something beyond belief would take place. Walking into the city of Leicester and approaching Angelina Narcisse, there was a disheveled-looking man. Angelina was shocked to discover that this familiar-looking man was claiming to be her deceased brother. Family and other villagers recognized him instantly, but they needed confirmation. The man recited intimate family information and even identified himself using a nickname from his childhood. This man was indeed Clairvius, and he had quite the story to tell. With sunken features and an aged look about him, the now 58-year-old man explained his bizarre passing and subsequent reanimation. After having been buried, he was dug up by a voodoo sorcerer with roots in Haitian voodoo, a spiritual system that believes in a supreme being and a pantheon of spirits known as Iwa. The religion is marked by gesture, where the goal is to serve the spirits. This may include song, dance, prayer, or even sacrifice. Prominent within the practices of voodoo are witchcraft and magic, with the manifestation of barbarism. The sorcerer, according to Clairvius, was hired and paid by his own brother following an inheritance dispute. The brother asked the sorcerer to turn him into a zombie with the use of something referred to as zombie powder. This was administered to him prior to his supposed passing, which placed him in a paralyzed yet conscious state. This made it appear as though he was no longer living. Clairvius recalls his burial, where dirt was thrown on top of him, and later recalls the earth being moved off of him. Once he was exhumed, he was allegedly fed a strange paste believed to have been derived from datura, which can lead to memory loss at certain doses. For the next 2 years, he was supposedly kept in a semi-conscious state where the sorcerer had forced him to work on a sugarcane plantation, surrounded by other zombies. To maintain this state, Clairvius claimed that they would be given the poison regularly. But one day, the overseer forgot to give him a dose, and it was right then and there that everything changed. With a newfound feeling of fear and clarity, Clairvius made a run for it. But fearing for his brother, who may still be out to get him, he kept to the shadows, hiding and avoiding everyone who knew him. It wasn't until his brother's passing that he would finally return to his sister, revealing the nightmare he'd been living for 18 years. In March of 1990, Carrie Selvage, a 43-year-old Indianapolis schoolteacher, was admitted to the Indianapolis State Hospital. According to hospital records, she was admitted there on an account of a nervous breakdown, although the cause of her stress was not made public. Carrie came from a prominent family that insisted that she have a large room with a nice view. Given their status, the hospital happily obliged, and Carrie was given a spacious area on the first floor with quite a view. There, she would remain for the duration of her visit, which would be ominously cut short. On the 11th of March, a few days after her arrival at the hospital, a nurse entered the room to find the patient standing at the window, taking in the scenic view. She requested a glass of milk, and the nurse gladly went to get it, locking the door behind her. The nurse was out for no more than 5 minutes, but when she re-entered the room, she found something almost impossible. Carrie was gone. Immediately, the rest of the hospital staff were alerted, and a search began. The woman wouldn't have been hard to miss. She was wearing only felt slippers and an expensive, long blue bedgown. Despite the quick response and the obvious clothing that Carrie wore, the hospital failed to find her. It was that afternoon that the brother of the now missing patient, Joseph, arrived at the hospital, only to be told that his sister wasn't there anymore. Joseph informed the rest of the family, and the disappearance of Carrie Selvage saw the congregation of law enforcement and volunteers. The search was on. For days on end, the group of family, volunteers, hospital staff, and police officers scoured the area from the hospital grounds to the woods, and from lakes and creeks to the smallest of ponds. There was nothing. Eventually, the search efforts ceased, and authorities could now only rely on whatever tips they received, even offering a generous reward for information that led to Carrie's whereabouts. Some claimed to have seen her boarding a train bound for Ohio, but these claims were never proven. It wouldn't be until a harrowing 2 years later that the first break in the case would finally come. It was 1902 at the Indianapolis Medical College, where eager students stared down at a corpse on the table. There was a lecture underway on proper dissection techniques. Before it could commence, though, one medical student stopped the procedure and pointed out the body's resemblance to Carrie Selvage. The professor agreed. The body on the table certainly looked like the missing woman. Due to the state of decomposition, the professor decided to summon a local dentist, who reportedly performed Carrie's dental work previously. Upon discovering a gold tooth filled in the exact same place as the patient who disappeared, the dentist concluded this must be the person they were looking for. When Joseph showed up to examine the body, potentially belonging to his sister, he couldn't say with confidence if this was her or not. Law enforcement spoke to the staff of the college and learned how they came to acquire it. A well-known name came up. He was a local man already known to the authorities due to his illegal line of work. Rufus Cantrell, the king of the ghouls, was a notorious grave robber from whom the college would purchase the body. Cantrell was arrested, and he delivered the darkest of details present in the trade. Willingly, he would suggest the names of other grave robbers and their body-stealing methods. He even offered the names of several surgeons who purchased from him, and even paid extra for more fresh cadavers. It didn't take long for the police to come up with an eerie story that they fed to the public. According to them, Cantrell confessed to the slaying of Carrie. Allegedly, he stated that on the evening of the disappearance, he and some grave robbers were working nearby when they spotted a woman sneaking around the hospital grounds. Concerned that she might attract attention to them, the group decided to kidnap her, and they took her to the basement of an old farmhouse. There, they allegedly abused the woman for days on end until she succumbed to the trauma. Then Cantrell made the sale. Police would go on to sentence the grave robber to 10 years in prison, with this story being the consensus. Only, this is not what happened. The story was completely made up to allow authorities to put someone behind bars and give closure to the high-status family who were impatiently awaiting for answers. 20 years later, the Indianapolis State Hospital was old and no longer served its initial purpose. So a local company decided to buy the building and turn it into a machine shop. When a construction crew began to remove several pieces of the building, including one particular section in the attic, something incredibly disturbing was found. An iron worker who was tasked with removing a cubbyhole situated above the attic found that the area was too small and requested a section of the attic to be removed in order to gain better access to the cupola. As the worker peered into the large entrance, the color would drain from his face. He'd come face to face with a skeleton. The police were quickly called to the scene to investigate. They discovered that the remains were in a seated position, wearing an expensive, long blue dress with felt slippers lying nearby. It was confirmed this was the skeleton of Carrie Selvage, who was supposedly buried in a family graveyard 20 years earlier when she was identified by a gold tooth in a medical college. It turned out the cadaver was not Carrie after all, and the story about her slaughter was completely made up. This left many questions unanswered. The initial body was now a Jane Doe, and the real Carrie had somehow found her way into this small area of the attic, and her COD was never determined. When a man called Forrest Fenn received the news that he'd been diagnosed with cancer in 1988, his life understandably changed forever. He decided he wanted to leave a lasting impression on the world, and to do this he put together a treasure trove and buried it in an outdoor area. Fortunately, he managed to beat the cancer, and he then published a memoir called The Thrill of the Chase, which contained different tales from his life. It's in these memoirs that he first revealed the treasure and described it as containing gold, coins, expensive stones, and jewelry. He added that the tales in his book contained clues to the treasure's whereabouts, and that it was buried somewhere in the mountains that lay north of Santa Fe. One chapter in the book, entitled Gold and More, provided readers with a set of 9 clues that, when deciphered, would lead them straight to the chest. Before long, treasure hunters were feverishly trying to solve the clues, and many started searching in New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana, but none were successful. They knew that the treasure was worth around $2 million, a life-changing amount of money, and so for many years the hunt continued. Unfortunately, the treasure hunt claimed the lives of 5 people before it was ever found, and Finn was asked to end the hunt once and for all to avoid further tragedy, but he declined. All of these searchers went missing while looking for the treasure, and they would eventually be found deceased in the wilderness after being reported as missing. But in 2009, a medical student named Jack Stoff had just graduated from college where he was studying medicine. He decided to pursue a career in writing instead. He soon realized that this was a mistake, and in 2018, he heard about the Finn treasure for the first time. He became obsessed with finding it, and he became one of the 300,000 people who were trying to solve the puzzle. He pored over Finn's memoirs, and in 2020, he traveled to the Wyoming Rocky Mountains as he believed the clues pointed in that direction. Since Finn had mentioned that he was considering being buried in the treasure's location, Jack started searching for that spot, and for 25 days he hiked through the mountains looking for a likely area. Then, on the 6th of June of that year, his efforts finally paid off. At first, he chose to remain anonymous, but he met with Finn, and it was confirmed he had indeed solved the riddle, and Finn would pass away just 2 months later. Jack decided to remain anonymous out of fear that the other treasure hunters who'd been searching for the chest for years may become irate at the fact that it had been found before they could find it, and that they would attempt to steal it. But after Finn passed away, it was revealed that the person who found the treasure would be named in court, and he decided to reveal his identity. Nevertheless, a lawsuit soon ensued as people believed Jack had cheated, or that he was employed by Finn, who told him where to dig. One woman believed he'd hacked into her phone somehow and managed to find the treasure when she couldn't. She believed the treasure should be transferred to her, since she'd been searching for a lot longer than he had. She then revealed that she believed the treasure was found in Mexico, and she was quickly corrected. Several more people attempted to sue Jack and Finn, but none were successful. He's never revealed where he found the treasure, and has no plans to do so. Sandro Botticelli was an Italian painter and draftsman who lived from 1445 to 1510, by historians' best estimations, and at the height of his career, he was considered one of Italy's finest artists. He rose to fame for his depictions of the Madonna and Child, altarpieces, and paintings of mythological figures, and by all accounts, he was a very intelligent man. At school, he struggled to pay attention since he found it tedious, and so his parents decided to send him to train with a goldsmith. He then met with artist Fra Filippo Lippi and started working at his studio. He learned how to paint frescoes and was asked to paint several of these for churches in Italy. He then tried his hand at engraving, and by 1470 he was able to open his own studio. He soon became acquainted with influential Italian families, most notably the Medicis, for whom he completed several custom pieces. He was fond of painting divine figures such as Moses, and on a few occasions completed portraits of the Pope. In 1481, he was commissioned by the Pope to decorate the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Some of his best-known pieces include the Birth of Venus and Venus and Mars, both of which are still considered to be masterpieces today. By the 1490s, Italy was in less than great shape due to invasions and plagues that hit, and as a result, Botticelli's work started to change into a more simplistic and less refined style. It's been suggested that he became involved in the unstable political climate at the time, but this remains speculation. By this time, Michelangelo and Raphael had become the favored artists, and Botticelli's work became less popular. He fell into a deep depression, and before long he lost all of his money and started living in isolation. His health started to decline, and in 1590 he passed away. Following this, his works and name fell into obscurity, and it's believed that only about 50 of his paintings still exist. In the 19th century, art lovers returned to the Florentine style, and his works were appreciated once more. In 1930, It was revealed that one of these paintings, called the Madonna of the Veil, had been discovered by an art collector, Lord Lee, and the art world was filled with excitement. He stated that he had purchased the painting from an Italian art dealer for $25,000, and it was eventually gifted to a gallery in London in 1947. People flocked to marvel at the piece, and it was quickly hailed as one of Botticelli's best. But this excitement would be dampened when the director of the National Gallery noticed that the Madonna had a certain charm about her, which reminded him of a movie star. Furthermore, it was noticed that the Prussian blue that was used to paint her robe had not been used before the 18th century, and that the pigment used had likely been ground using a machine. It was eventually discovered that the actual painter of the piece was a man named Umberto, who passed away in 1970, after working as a teacher at the Institute of Fine Arts in Siena. He was a well-known forger who displayed impressive skill, but since he'd never mentioned the Madonna of the Veil, it's believed that he intentionally attempted to pass it off as a Botticelli. The HMS Gloucester was constructed in 1652 with the intention of being used by the English Navy. It's known to have taken part in several battles, most notably during the Anglo-Spanish War that lasted from 1654 to 1660, as well as the Anglo-Dutch War. But in 1682, the HMS Gloucester was sailing from London to Edinburgh with the Duke of York, James Stuart, aboard. His wife was pregnant in Edinburgh, and he was on his way to get her so that she could relocate to London. But the journey was an ill-fated one. At some point, James and the ship's captain, James Ayres, started arguing about the best route to take, and before long they hit a sandbank. It was obvious the ship would go under, but James, for reasons unknown, refused to abandon ship until the very last minute. At the time, it was protocol that no one aboard any ship could abandon it before any royalty that was aboard, and thanks to this delay, 250 people lost their lives while James walked away unscathed. In the aftermath, he blamed the captain and demanded that he be executed, but Ayres was tried and sent to prison instead, while James went on to be crowned king. For the next few centuries, no one could figure out where the ship had gone under, and historians stated that if it was ever found, it would be the single most important historic maritime discovery since the raising of the Mary Rose, which occurred in 1982. After hearing about the elusive wreckage, two brothers, Julian and Lincoln Barnwell, started searching for the ship. For many years, they would dive off the coast of Norfolk in England, but mostly found German U-boats and warships from days gone by. Luckily, during one dive session, one of the brothers spotted a cannon on the sea floor, and he immediately became excited. Further investigation confirmed that they had finally discovered the HMS Gloucester, and they reveled in the moment, since in that instant, they were the only people alive who knew where the ship had gone down 300 years earlier. In the years that followed, the artifacts found on board were collected and studied. They provided historians with a unique insight into the lives of people of that era and the last voyage that the ship took. Efforts were made to identify the 250 people who perished on that fateful day, since very little is known about them, but only a few have been identified in the years that have since passed. Many of the recovered artifacts were displayed at the Norwich Castle Museum and Art Gallery, and further research is being conducted to decipher more facts about this mystery. It isn't often that a mystery is solved after years of investigation, only for the solution to be lost over time. But that's exactly what happened in the riddle of Cain's Jawbone, a novella that was written by a man named Edward Mathers under the pseudonym Torquemada. Mathers was the Observer newspaper's first ever cryptic crossword inventor, and in 1934, he penned Cain's Jawbone, but it was no ordinary book. Though it contained a murder mystery that was intended to be solved by the reader, this was no easy task, since the 100 pages that it contained were printed out of order. He played this off as a mistake, knowing full well that this disorganized format would create buzz around the book, and readers did their best to determine the correct order in vain. They knew that they had to identify 6 murderers and their 6 victims, but the task proved to be far more daunting than initially believed. The challenge lay in the way that the pages were printed. Each page ended with a full stop, and hence the reader couldn't simply find the end of the previous sentence on the following page. Hence, each page started with a new sentence, making the tasks very tricky. Furthermore, the language was intentionally vague and littered with puns, poems, strange clues, and excerpts that were intended to deceive and confuse. But in the 1930s, S. Sidney Turner and W. S. Kennedy were finally able to find the correct page order, and they were each awarded prizes of £25, or about $35 US. With the puzzle solved, people started losing interest in Kane's jawbone, and it faded into obscurity. Then, in 2017, a copy of the book was presented to the Lawrence Stern Trust, and it caught the attention of Patrick Wildgust, the curator of Shandy Hall. He decided he'd try to solve it, and he was successful, becoming only the third person to do so. The book was then republished in its original order, and a £1,000 or $1,400 reward was offered by the Unbound Publishing Company to anyone who could solve it, though readers only had 12 months to decipher the mystery. 12 people entered the competition, but only one was able to solve it. John Finmore, a British comedy writer, became the fourth person to find the correct page order, and he described it as the most difficult puzzle he'd ever attempted to solve. He almost gave up on several occasions, since he found the puzzle to just be far too difficult, but luckily he persevered. He'd spread the pages out on his spare bed, and for 4 months he tried to make sense of the narrative. When he finally succeeded, Patrick Wildgust was asked to confirm that the puzzle was solved, which he then did. The two men have sworn to never reveal the correct order of the pages, so that other readers can attempt to solve the riddle, and the Lawrence Stern Trust has stated that it will keep a record of any future successful attempts. Margaret Maitland, the principal curator of the ancient Mediterranean at National Museums, located in Scotland, has ended a mystery that's been plaguing historians since the discovery of several statues in Egypt in the 1850s. These statues, that are believed to be around 3,000 years old, were found during excavations that were carried out in the village of Deir el-Medina, which is located close to the Valley of Kings. The dig was conducted by a group of archaeologists that was led by Alexander Henry Rend, who hails from Scotland. Thanks to the items found there, it was determined that the people who lived in the village thousands of years ago were very proficient at building tombs, and so they were tasked with constructing tombs for the pharaohs of the time. One statue in particular took Egyptologists by surprise as soon as it was uncovered. It showed two figures, one clearly a child sitting in the lap of the other, an adult. While this may not seem strange, the fact that the child is a pharaoh makes the statue a very strange one indeed, as pharaohs wouldn't have been depicted in this manner very often. Since the village is located in a remote area, the statues that were found there lay undisturbed for centuries, and when they were finally found, they were in remarkably good condition. At first, experts were baffled by the piece, since it seemed to break every rule as far as depicting pharaohs was concerned. A non-royal person was never depicted alongside a pharaoh. But when Maitland decided to examine the other statues at the site, the pieces started to fall into place. She found that two more strange figures were found, depicting statesmen in the process of dedicating statues of a pharaoh, and so the smaller figure was actually a statue, not a depiction of a living person. Further excavations of the site revealed that the village's inhabitants were highly skilled craftsmen who became very wealthy thanks to their proficiency in their craft. They were also highly educated, as is evidenced by the discovery of messages that they wrote to each other, complaints that were sent to vendors, lists that were created, and even jokes that were written down. But the question still remained who the statues depicted. It was noted that one of the kneeling figures had a garland of flowers on its head, a practice common to women at the time, but men also used to wear these during the reign of Ramses II. Hence, it's believed that the kneeling figure was one of Ramses II's followers, but the robes worn by the figure didn't match that one of his followers would have worn. It was then suggested that he was a scribe, who would have created the inscriptions on the tombs of the pharaohs. If he served under Ramses II, the figure is likely a man named Ramos, who's known to have been Ramses' scribe. It's been determined that when ancient Egypt fell, the village of Deir el-Medina was abandoned and its inhabitants never returned. The village was never rebuilt, and the artifacts that have since been found there were left behind for thousands of years, providing us with a mystery that's finally been solved more than a century after its discovery. In 1913, 30-year-old Leo M. Frank was employed as a superintendent at a pencil factory in Atlanta a job that he started after graduating from Cornell University. One of the employees who worked under him at the factory was a girl named Mary Fagan, who by all accounts was liked by everyone she met. She was in charge of a machine that placed metal tips on the ends of the pencils, and on the morning of the 26th of April of that year, she planned to attend the Confederate Day Parade, which honored veterans of the Southern Army and their fallen fellow soldiers. She'd only worked one shift that week since the factory had run out of metal tips, and so she first went to the factory to collect her pay, which was around $1.20. Unbeknownst to her, everyone at the factory had been paid the day before, since the day of the parade was considered a holiday, and when she arrived, she found the doors locked. But she knew that one of the side doors would be unlocked, and after entering, she walked up to the second floor of the building. And here, Frank was poring over his books as he tried to catch up with his paperwork. Mary asked him for her pay, which he then got from a safe, and before leaving, she asked if the metal tips had arrived, but Frank told her they hadn't yet. He would later state that he then heard her walking back down the stairs, and later on he heard a woman's voice, but couldn't be certain of that fact. After Amy left the factory, she inexplicably disappeared. At around 3 a.m. the next morning, a night watchman at the factory found her deceased in the building's basement, and he immediately called the police. She'd clearly fought to break free from her attacker since coal and cinders were found under her fingernails, and it was determined she'd suffered a blow to the head before her life was ended. On the ground, they found 2 notes that seemed to indicate that an African-American man was the culprit, and it was determined that her attacker had fled through the back door undetected. The crime caused outrage in the community, which demanded answers from the police, who'd been unable to solve several other heinous crimes that had occurred in recent history. This caused them to act hastily, and Frank was asked to identify her remains. Investigators determined that he seemed nervous while doing so, since he started to tremble and struggled to look at her. They took this as a sign of guilt, and he was arrested. At his trial, it was revealed that he returned to the morgue to look at evidence that had been collected, but this was seen as a killer returning to gloat over his victim. He was finally found guilty and handed a death sentence, but this sentence was later commuted to life in prison. This outraged members of the community, who then stormed the prison and removed Frank before ending his life. They believed that justice had been done, but this was a misconception. More than 70 years later, a man named Alonzo Mann, who worked as Frank's office assistant, came forward to report that on the day of the murder, he saw janitor Jim Conley with Mary in his arms after she'd been knocked unconscious. The tale of the Pearl Harbor ghost plane is a mystery that plagued military and paranormal experts for decades, since accounts of the event seemed to defy all logic. But thanks to exhaustive investigative efforts, it's now been finally solved. The tale goes as follows. On the 8th of December, 1942, soldiers stationed at Kinao in China were made aware of an American P-40B Tomahawk plane that was headed straight to their location from Formosa. Strangely, it was reported that an insignia had been seen on the side of the plane that had not been used in the military since the attack on Pearl Harbor. And when asked to identify himself, the pilot chose not to respond. It was immediately assumed that the plane was sent by the Japanese military, and the plane was disguised to look as though it were American. 2 pilots named Scott and Hampshire were ordered to investigate, and they took off in their planes before quickly flying to the plane's location. They attempted to communicate with the pilot, but again got no response. They then decided to open fire, but even then the pilot didn't try to fight back or flee, which struck them as strange. They then realized that the plane had been badly damaged before their arrival, since the canopy was missing, and one of the ailerons was missing, as was part of one of the wings. The pilot was unconscious as his head was slumped to his chest, and they realized he would not be able to land since the plane's landing gear was also missing. As the 3 planes flew through a thick cloud cover, Scott and Hampshire lost sight of the plane and eventually saw it fall to the ground, where it crashed in a rice paddy. Soldiers immediately rushed to the area, and the plane was located, but the pilot was nowhere to be found. Inside the plane, they found a journal that was used to determine that the plane had set off from the island of Mindanao, which was located thousands of miles away. It was speculated that the pilot was shot down more than a year earlier and had somehow survived. He'd managed to scavenge parts from other downed planes to fix his own, but since it had no landing gear, it was impossible for the plane to take off, and so many people started to believe something paranormal was at play. For decades, this narrative has been retold, with no one able to solve the mystery of the pilot's identity and how the plane made it all the way to the area where it finally fell. There seemed to be no logical explanation, but many years later, World War II fighting ace Colonel Walter Lee Scott Jr. would come forward to reveal that he'd created the entire story many years earlier, and that he'd never believed it'd be taken as seriously as it was. In 1989, an unsuspecting motorist found something by the side of the road in Stockton, California, that would lead investigators to believe that they were dealing with a very dangerous person who needed to be apprehended as soon as possible. On the 15th of August of that year, a man whose name has not been made public was traveling in that area with his family when their car suddenly started to overheat. He immediately pulled over, and after taking a look at the engine, decided the best thing to do would be to call for aid. Back in those days, cell phones were very uncommon, and so he and his son started walking down the road in search of a phone booth. Along the way, they spotted something by the side of the road, and as they neared, they realized it was a camouflage jacket. They picked it up to see if it had been marked by the owner, and when they checked the pockets, they were surprised to find it contained a VHS tape, but they had no idea what was on the tape since it wasn't labeled. After calling for help and getting the car back on the road, the family traveled home, and the father and son decided to see what was on the tape. To their horror, it contained footage of a house that was burnt down, and worried that it might show a crime that was committed, they turned it over to the police. Investigators believed that the person who recorded the footage, and who could be heard speaking on the recording, was also responsible for setting the blaze. The footage bothered investigators due to its creepy nature, and they were determined to identify the culprit. They watched and listened to the footage over and over again, and while not everything the man said could be deciphered, they eventually wrote down what they would later describe as a script of what was said. He could be heard saying, "I told you I'd do it, Omar," and immediately they started searching for someone by that name. They didn't know if Omar was the owner of the house, the arsonist's accomplice, or merely someone whom he intended to show the footage to later on. The man who found the tape asked his brother to take a county arson investigator to the area where the tape was found. And unbelievably, the camouflage jacket was still lying in the same spot. When it was searched, he found a wooden pestle used for grinding herbs in one of the pockets. In the surrounding area, matching gloves and a ceramic skull were found, and it was immediately assumed that the fire was part of some strange satanic ritual. But no one knew the location of the burning house, and with no further leads, investigators decided to air the footage on an episode of the show Mysterious Mysteries. Minutes after the broadcast, several people contacted the police to report that they recognized the house and that it was located in Redwood City, California. They revealed that the house was under construction at the time and that it had been rebuilt after a fire. Callers directed the police to a man living in Woodside, and he then pointed the finger at a 19-year-old man from Redwood City, who was found to be the arsonist. The man, whose identity has not been made public, was arrested after admitting to the crime, and he was sent to a mental health facility to serve out his sentence. Most of us work with a computer every day, but have no idea how to hack someone else's system. But for a man named Kevin Poulsen, this seemed to come naturally, and eventually he became known as a most accomplished hacker while working for the SRI International Research Institute, also known as Stanford Research Institute International. Long before this, on his 16th birthday, Poulsen received his first computer, a TRS-80, as a gift. Thanks to his high IQ, which is believed to have been over 135, he soon started becoming interested in technological advancements and figured out how to exploit telephone lines, a practice known as phone phreaking, which allows the caller to make unlimited calls without being charged. Eventually, he figured out how to hack other people's computers, and he adopted the nickname Dark Dante. While in the 11th grade, he decided to drop out of school, after which he became friends with a man called Ronald Austin. He started teaching Ronald how to hack systems, and they started targeting ARPANET, the precursor to the internet. In 1983, Kevin managed to hack into military research on the systems of the University of California, Berkeley, and he eventually cracked the password, which was UCB. By now, the authorities were aware of the Dark Dante character that regularly infiltrated this network, and on one occasion, Kevin accidentally used his real name, but investigators allowed him to continue his illegal activities for the time being. But on the 22nd of September, they'd had enough, and his location was tracked. His identity was revealed, and his computer was confiscated for analysis. Ronald was arrested, but Kevin was let off with a warning. Having heard of his abilities, the Stanford Research Institute contacted Kevin, and instead of being sent to jail, he was offered a job. He taught military officials how to properly secure their networks, but his dream job wouldn't last long. In 1988, he forgot to pay the rent on a storage locker, and when the owner of the facility checked its contents, he found forged documents, locksmith tools, phone company manuals, and blank IDs as well as birth certificates. The police were called, and when they questioned Kevin, he stated he'd found these items in trash bins while dumpster diving. But it was soon discovered he'd hacked into several government agencies and that he'd given those passwords to fellow hackers. He was placed at the top of the FBI's most wanted list, but he eluded authorities for the next 17 months. He was eventually arrested at a Hughes Market in Los Angeles, and 4 of his fellow hackers testified against him at trial. The murder of 18-year-old Mary Agnes Klinsky remained unsolved for more than 5 decades until advancements in DNA technology finally revealed who was responsible for the crime that claimed her life. At around 3:30 p.m. on the 15th of September, 1965, Mary was last seen by a few of her family members when she left their house in New Jersey after stating she was on her way to mail a letter to her boyfriend who was serving aboard the USS Mauna Loa, which was, at the time, located in the Mediterranean Sea. They had decided they would get engaged once he returned from his military service. Her sisters would later tell investigators that they saw her that day, sitting alone on a bench near the beach, close to a boardwalk. They added that this sighting was around 9 p.m. that night, but she never came home. The next day, a Garden State Parkway road crew was working near the Parkway southbound entrance when they happened upon her body, and they immediately notified the authorities. She was located behind a guardrail, and it was determined that someone had assaulted her, but robbery was ruled out since none of her jewelry had been stolen. An autopsy revealed that someone had repeatedly hit her in the head, and DNA evidence was collected, but no suspect could be identified since the relevant technology still didn't exist yet. The New Jersey State Police interviewed several witnesses and suspects, but no one knew who had ended Mary's life. The case went cold for the next 5 decades until it was revisited in 2016, and the collected DNA evidence was sent for analysis. This time, a DNA profile was created, and it was linked to a serial killer named Robert Zirinsky, who was known to be responsible for ending the lives of at least 3 other women. Mary is believed to have been his very first victim, and when further witness statements put him in the area at the time of the attack, his fate was sealed. He was already incarcerated by this point, having been found guilty of ending the lives of Rosemary Calandriello and Jane Derua. Mary became the oldest cold case ever solved in New Jersey at the time. It's since come to light that Zirinsky may have been responsible for ending the lives of at least 4 more women, but this could never be proven since he passed away in 2008 and was only ever convicted of one of his crimes. Investigators have stated, though, that they're looking into other similar cases from that time, in case other unsolved cases can be linked to Zirinsky. When he passed away, he was serving time at the Southwoods State Prison while awaiting trial for the murder of Jane Derua. It was also revealed in 1958 that he may have been involved in an incident that led to a police officer named Charles Bernosky losing his life. On the 28th of November that year, Bernosky accidentally interrupted Zirinsky and his accomplice, Theodore Schaefer, who was Zirinsky's cousin. The 2 men fled after being wounded by the officer, but they fired back and unfortunately ended his life. Zirinsky's sister testified that the 2 men confided in her that they were responsible, and while Bernosky was sent to prison, Zirinsky was eventually set free when his conviction was overturned. Had this not been done, his victims would never have lost their lives at his hands, but despite all this, Mary's family has stated they're glad the case has at least been solved. And while this won't bring Mary back, they're glad to finally learn who was responsible for her passing, which at least gave them some sense of closure. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most renowned historical figures, served as a French military leader who conquered much of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1804, after seizing political power in France through a coup, he crowned himself emperor. Napoleon, according to surviving historical records, was shrewd, ambitious, and a skilled strategist. He was no doubt successful in the wars he waged upon various European nations. That was until he wasn't. The great military leader was bound to make a mistake eventually, and he certainly did with the invasion of Russia in 1812. 2 years earlier, Russia had withdrawn from the continental system, which of course angered Napoleon, who now sought vengeance. In retaliation for the withdrawal, the French leader would lead a massive army into Russia in the summer of 1812, and what a fatal endeavor that would turn out to be. Not expecting his opposition to be as prepared as they were, Napoleon's forces attacked the Russians, but they adopted an unexpected strategy of falling back whenever the forces tried to attack. As a result of this tactic, the French troops had moved deeper into Russia. Despite not being prepared for an extended campaign, Napoleon ordered his troops to press on, and by September, both sides had suffered tremendous casualties, with the Battle of Borodino being the driving factor. Still adamant to overthrow Russia, the French continued their invasion and marched on into Moscow. There, they would discover that the whole population had fled and had set fires all across the cities, preventing the troops from gathering much-needed supplies and resources. Still, Napoleon stood his ground, waiting for a surrender that was never going to happen. He stayed in Russia with his ill-prepared troops and was soon faced with the onset of the Russian winter. The armies were cold and starving, and Napoleon had no choice but to leave Moscow. But the retreat proved even more disastrous. As the troops dragged their weary bodies back home, they were constantly harassed by the Russian army, which was not only aggressive, but merciless. By the end of it, the military leader had lost 100,000 men. Napoleon had made the obvious mistake of invading Russia, and it ultimately led to his undoing, having set off a chain reaction. As an indirect result of his biggest mistake, he was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to Elba, an island off the coast of Italy, where he was given sovereignty. This disastrous invasion would alter the course of history, ending the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte and the French dominance. Number 9. The units of measurement used by the United States have become something of a joke in the modern era. Imperial units evolved from the Middle Ages and were used by Great Britain and other parts of the world until the metric system was introduced. Great Britain adapted to using the metric system along with the rest of the world, but the United States opted to remain with the customary system, based upon the old British imperial system. Imperial units are not legally defined in metric terms. With the United States being the only country that still employs the customary system that uses inches, feet, yards, and miles, there's bound to be some errors with conversions. Sometimes it can be as simple as accidentally using a tablespoon instead of a teaspoon, or hearing someone say that it weighs a ton, and having to ask, is it a metric ton or a short ton? When ordinary people make these kinds of measurement mix-ups, they wouldn't get anything worse than a bowl of bad food. But for NASA, such a slip-up can have a significant impact, potentially even resulting in the loss of $327 million. In an effort to learn more about Mars's climate, atmosphere, and surface changes, NASA spent $125 million to build the Mars Climate Orbiter, a 638-kilogram robotic space probe. Engineers at Lockheed Martin came from various countries, with some engineers being from the United States. During the construction of the orbiter, a confusing human error was made. While the engineers were using mostly imperial units, everyone else there was using the metric system. On the 11th of December, 1998, the Mars Climate Orbiter was launched. For 9.5 months, it made its way to its destination with no errors arising. But once it came into the vicinity of its destination in September, the orbiter disappeared. For some reason, the interplanetary weather satellite flew too close to Mars, causing it to burn up and rip apart in the atmosphere. It turned out this was no random accident. It was a fatal error that came from the use of two different systems. The navigation team at Jet Propulsion Laboratory was using millimeters and meters in their calculations. they were unaware of a mathematical blunder that lingered within. The Lockheed Martin Astronautics had designed the craft using inches, feet, and pounds, and JPL's failure to notice that conversion proved fatal. Number 8. One of the best-known defeats of the Roman Empire was the fall of Constantinople. For a harrowing 53 days beginning in April of 1453, the Ottoman Empire set out to decimate what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire. They shook the city of Constantinople until they were able to breach the massive walls, ultimately conquering whatever was left standing of the Romans. But the conquest may have ended a lot differently, altering the course of history, if it weren't for one unfortunate error, and it all centered around one man named Orban. Orban, believed to be of Hungarian origin, was a cannon caster who made use of bronze bombards, even though the use of bronze had already been abandoned some years prior. Realizing that he could make a living from these services, the caster began searching for those in need of them. His first stop would be the court of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. Here, he pitched his cannons and offered his services to the emperor. At first, Constantine was delighted to meet the maker of this technology and sought to use it to his advantage. He'd viewed it in action sometime earlier and was impressed by its incredible power and how it smashed through solid rock. Even though he was impressed by the weaponry, there was a major issue. Constantine didn't have the necessary resources to employ the services. Timber was in short supply and was one of the resources required for foundry fires. The empire didn't even have enough money to offer Orban, so he reluctantly had to turn him away, a blunder that would be his ultimate undoing. Orban left the city and headed off in search of a new customer, so he made his way to the court of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the very sultan who would lay waste to Constantinople. The Ottoman capital was known as Adrianople, located in the province of Edirne, west of the city he had just departed. After arriving there, Orban requested to meet with Mehmed and present his services. The Ottoman was informed of the traveler's skills and welcomed him happily. It was here that Orban had found his new customer, who had the necessary resources to make use of his services. Orban headed to his foundry, and in 3 months, a 27-foot-long cannon with a diameter of 2.5 to 3 feet was made. It could fire a stone that weighed anywhere between 1,440 and 1,500 pounds. The barrel would be walled with solid, thick bronze, which would stop it from exploding and ensure its stability. By January 1453, it was ready, and just a few months later, that cannon would be used to bring down the walls of Constantinople. Number 7. Everyone knows the story of Kim Jong-un, the North Korean political official who succeeded his father Kim Jong-il as the leader. The current leader of North Korea is the youngest of 3 sons, which brings about the question of why he would be named leader instead of the eldest son. It turns out that Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-il's oldest son, made a horrible mistake that removed him from the line of succession. Jong-nam was a scion who most expected to succeed his father, but one blunderous trip to Disneyland prevented that from happening, and it had one profound impact on the trajectory of history. It was May of 2001 when Jong-nam, eager to visit Tokyo's Disneyland, attempted to enter Japan, despite the hostile relations between the country and North Korea at the time. Regardless, he brought his wife and children along with him, expecting a fun-filled day ahead. Instead, Jong-nam would be abruptly arrested for the use of false or forged Dominican passports. There were a series of mistakes being made here, the first being that he was secretly traveling to a country during a time of hostility. His next would be presenting a Dominican passport that bore a Chinese name. This detail was, of course, suspicious to Japanese authorities, who swiftly arrested the Korean man and deported him. The event was so incredibly embarrassing for the family that Kim Jong-il actively shunned his oldest son, his expected heir. Ultimately, his younger half-brother, Kim Jong-un, would have to take his place as North Korea's leader. Adding to the Disneyland slip-up, Jong-nam was also in support of reform, as well as a free market policy, making him the absolute opposite of Jong-un and his father. If the expected heir hadn't made that fateful trip to Japan, North Korea's entire trajectory would be completely different. Jong-nam would have assumed the position of its leader and altered its course as we know it. Number 6. No list of historical errors is complete without the biggest human mistake of all time, the Trojan horse. The Trojan War is one of the most legendary conflicts known to history. It took place sometime between the 12th and 13th centuries BC. According to the traditional records, the son of the Trojan king, Paris, ran off with Helen, the wife of Menelaus of Sparta. Menelaus' brother, Agamemnon, would respond to this by leading a Greek expedition against the city of Troy, in a war that would last a harrowing 10 years. Agamemnon assembled an immense army of leaders. Initially, diplomatic attempts were made to resolve the dispute, but these efforts ultimately yielded no results. Greek forces would then surround the city and hold it under siege for the next decade. The Trojan War resulted in significant casualties on both sides, although the exact numbers are highly debated due to the controversy surrounding the conflict's validity. Homer's Iliad described 240 casualties of war, the narrative suggesting 188 Trojans and 52 Greeks. But other sources indicate a much higher number, which seems more likely given the way the war ended and the mistake that caused it. It was the 10th year of the war, and the lives of the greatest warriors on either side had already concluded by this time. The Greeks decided that they would make one last display to end the Trojans once and for all. First, they pretended to withdraw from the conflict, leading to the first major mistake of the Trojans, believing that they were victorious. In secret, the Greeks could craft a large wooden horse, which would come to be known as the Trojan horse. The creation was big enough to fit a person inside, and in fact it was so big that it could fit an entire raiding party within. The Greeks rolled the wooden horse to the gates of Troy, a group of warriors concealed within. Unaware of the lingering threat and believing that this was a gift to them and a sign of the end of the war, the Trojans accepted it. The horse was rolled into the center of the city, a blunder that would change history forever. As the people of the great city began to settle and celebrate their win, Greeks burst from the trap doors hidden on the structure and laid siege to the Trojans, massacring the men and making away with the women. The city was set alight, and only a lucky few made their escape. Number 5. It was 1836, and the Texas Revolution was raging. It would be that year that 60 delegates signed the Texas Declaration of Independence, and the Republic of Texas was born. Because they declared independence and defied authority, Mexico was angered and wanted all the Texian rebels to be slaughtered. General Santa Anna launched a decisive attack on the Alamo, an 18th century Franciscan mission in San Antonio, where a group of determined fighters had congregated. The mission, named for the cottonwood trees that surrounded it, consisted of 3 adobe buildings that saw log palisades enclosing the plaza areas. The walls were lined with up to 19 cannons, expecting conflict at some point, though unaware of the orders that had just been rolled out following the Texans' return home. Not knowing that Santa Anna's forces were on their way, the leaders of the rebellion failed to supply the necessary food, supplies, or ammunition. They would be in for a horrifying surprise come February 23rd. Mexican troops consisting of 1,800 to 6,000 men arrived at the wall of the Alamo, aiming to reclaim Texas. They viewed the mission as a strategic point, allowing them to gain the upper hand. The Mexican forces set up artillery on the walls and began a steady bombardment. And on waged the 13-day siege that left only carnage. The Alamo was red-stained, and although a few defenders were able to escape, a majority of the Texans would perish in the siege, approximately 200 of them. Among them were notable figures like William B. Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett. On the 16th of March that year, the final battle on the Alamo would take place. 4 columns of Mexican infantry attacked from several directions, and there were no loopholes, forcing the defenders to expose themselves in order to return fire. When they began to retreat, Santa Anna's forces rushed in, climbing over the wall and taking hold of the Alamo. With a minimal loss of Mexican soldiers in comparison to the Texans, Santa Anna viewed their attack as a victory. The battle was certainly a success. Or was it? It turned out that this brutal and forceful display was nothing more than a single catastrophic mistake that would alter the trajectory of the Texas Revolution and Mexican rule. Citizens of the new Republic of Texas were outraged by the destruction of the Alamo and the massacre of the Texans. Samuel Houston, an American lawyer and politician, knew that something had to be done and began to raise an army, unbeknownst to Mexican General Santa Anna. Volunteer companies joined his growing army while Mexico was distracted by crushing Texan rebels. By avoiding the troops, the Texas army was able to gain strength and training. The mercilessness of the Mexican army served as nothing more than encouragement for Texans to join the new formation. Just mere weeks later, the Texans' now fortified army, with around 900 men, moved through the marshland near the San Jacinto River. The defenders had split into two groups, and although there was a brief exchange of artillery fire, the Mexicans were unable to probe the armies. The defenders, though, weren't going to pounce properly just yet. Instead, they waited. As more reinforcements arrived for the opposition, they realized that no attack was coming. Santa Anna allowed the troops to relax, and when no attack came the following morning, they relaxed even further, even daring to post sentries. That afternoon, the risky decision was made, and General Houston launched his 900-man army, which moved quietly across the prairie. Taking the Mexican forces by surprise was a hail of ammo, the discharge of cannons, and a brutal assault that decimated them. By the end of the Battle of San Jacinto, 600 Mexicans were slain, and 700 more were captured, along with Santa Anna himself. They were only released when they agreed to end the war. Number 4. According to surviving historical records, military disasters were rare in the Roman world, and when they did occur, they were often met with recompense, often destroying the reputations of those involved. One of the most infamous historical military blunders was the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which was marred by errors from the outset. All those errors were blamed on a single figure, the man who led 3 Roman legions into an ambush, Publius Quintilius Varus. The provincial governor of Germania's lack of caution led to the event's alternate name, the Varus disaster. It was 9 AD when Varus led the 3 legions consisting of cavalry, helper troops, and regular citizens across territory that he mistook for being friendly. The forces were not marching in a battle formation, but rather traveling without the intent of engaging in battle, specifically against Germanic warriors. Although they had no intentions of conflict, the troops should have been ready for anything, given that their march was taking place during a time of discontent, which was also attributed to Varus, whose policies in Germania were unfavorable. The governor's blunders began days before the march even commenced. Several people came to him to warn him of an alleged plot against the Romans that was planned to take place in Germania. Supposedly, the attack was masterminded by someone who Varus trusted, Arminius, the Germanic chieftain. Ultimately, he disregarded the warnings and treated them as nothing more than rumors of conspiracy. Varus, being a trusted authority figure, should have investigated any reports regardless of how improbable he thought they were. Without carrying out such investigations, the legions, led by the governor, marched on. As the guided legions, who were not in battle formation but rather in a dangerously 9-mile-long line, made their way onto a narrow, marshy path, a storm began, setting the tone for a disaster that was inbound. Emerging from their hideouts, Germanic warriors pounced, light swords, lances, and spears in hand. They surrounded the entire Roman army and began throwing javelins at them. Once the attack had begun, Varus made his efforts to escape the onslaught and reach safety on the Rhine. It took several days for him and his army to battle through the hostile landscape, during which he was forced to build overnight camps and abandon the baggage train. Varus's decision to flee, though, was yet another mistake, making the whole situation even worse. As the legions continued to follow the governor, he would erroneously lead them into the site where the final stages of the battle would be made. The Romans would find themselves in an area known as Abaresh, the ultimate war zone. The entry into this zone ultimately sealed their fate. In the narrow sandbank channel, located between a mountain and bog, created by the Germans before the battle, the warriors were able to overwhelm the Roman soldiers. It was at this point that they'd entered combat disintegration, with many of them allowing themselves to be slain without much resistance. The blunder-filled defeat was viewed as a great humiliation for not just the Roman Empire, but also for Emperor Augustus. Surviving historical records blame the humiliation and the alteration to history as we know it on Verus, who ignored warnings of conspiracy, trusted the wrong people, chose a poor route to march through a thick forest, didn't send out any scouts to check the path, and also ignored signs of bad weather. We may never know why Verus made these unfortunate mistakes, but it was through those errors that history would be changed for good. Number 3. Since 1965, Exxon Corporation, later known as ExxonMobil, has been responsible for over 3,000 oil spills and leaks, and it would take them 24 years to actually learn their lesson and for change to be prompted, only as a result of one major incident that continues to have a severe impact on the environment today. It was the 24th of March 1989 when the oil tanker Exxon Valdez, owned by the Exxon Shipping Company, set off from Valdez, Alaska, bound for California. Not long into its voyage, the vessel would run aground, having hit a reef in Prince William Sound, the result of which was catastrophic. 11 million gallons of oil spewed out into the ocean. Delayed efforts in containing the spill allowed heavy winds and strong waves to disperse the crude oil across the Sound. 1,300 miles worth of indented shoreline was left polluted, along with any adjacent water that ran as far as the southern end of the Shelikof Strait. The impact on oceanic wildlife and their habitats was immense. The oil spill would eliminate an estimated 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 otters, 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, and some 22 orca whales, as well as billions of salmon and herring eggs. Given the inaccessibility of the Prince William Sound, the cleanup proved all the more difficult. Exxon would go on to spend well over $3.8 billion in cleanup costs, but even with such an expense, the damage had already been done, altering the trajectory of the affected animals and their homes, built on shore and in the waters. Despite the efforts that took place to contain and clean up the crude oil, more than 20 years later, some species are still labeled as not recovering, as a direct result of the blunder. After much investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board assigned a significant amount of the blame to Exxon, referring to its lack of competency and overworked crew. Further investigation revealed that the ship's captain had been drinking intoxicating beverages just before the accident, leading Exxon to terminate his employment. The United States Coast Guard was also criticized for its improper enforcement of traffic regulations. Ultimately, the event would trigger a chain reaction, where settlement funds would be used to fund restoration and protection projects. Prince William Sound, the Gulf of Alaska, and habitats outside of the state received the majority of the funding. 600,000 acres of land have been placed under protection through the settlement funds. Today, long-term monitoring of the marine conditions, as well as restoration efforts, are ongoing. One of the activities involved focuses on the oil that still lingers, posing great risks to wildlife and the ocean as a whole. Only one positive outcome came from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and that was the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which not only strengthened, but also streamlined the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to both prevent and respond to catastrophes involving oil spills. It also established legal liabilities of responsible parties and scheduled the banning of all single-hulled oil tankers from the United States, which came into effect in 2015. Number 2. Famous for his military erudition and sowing the seeds of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar also gave the month of July its name, and was responsible for slaughtering millions of Celtic Gauls. Allegedly a descendant of the Trojan prince Aeneas, the birth of Caesar marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history. He greatly expanded the geographic reach of the Roman Empire and established the imperial system. By 31 years old, he'd already fought in several wars, became involved in politics, and through several alliances and victories, he would ultimately become a dictator. Based on historical records, it seemed as though Caesar was formidable, and it seemed that he thought the same. It was his pride and idea of being invincible that led the Roman dictator to make some serious, misguided mistakes. Those errors presented themselves in the unfortunate form of ignorance when it came to the warnings of his assassination. There were several factors that contributed to why some people wanted Caesar to cease, but one of the main reasons was his rapid rise in power and ambition. The Roman elites were growing increasingly concerned after the figure appointed himself as the dictator for life, giving him unprecedented power. Essentially, Caesar was a monarch. The move was of course viewed as a great threat to the traditional Roman government system, which at the time was structured upon a balance of power between factions. During his rise to power, the Roman dictator found himself with a copious number of enemies. His victories and dealings made him into a tyrant, willing to trample on the rights and traditions of the Roman Republic. Although he was likely aware that he was a target, Caesar still believed that he was an immovable force. So when those warnings of his impending assassination came, he ignored them. The first warning came from Spurina, a soothsayer of Haruspex. The expert in divination and interpretation of omens discovered the imminent threat and went straight to the ruler on the 15th of February, 44 BC. Having examined the entrails of a sacrificed animal, specifically that of a bull missing its heart, Spurina warned Caesar and told him that he was to be cautious for the next 30 days. The conspirators knew that Caesar would be embarking on a long military campaign that would take him away from Rome in mid-March. This made the prophecy's date anything but a coincidence, since the assassins needed to get the job done before he left the city. Caesar, of course, shrugged off the suggestion and continued as routine. That would be his first mistake. The second warning came from his wife, Calpurnia, who had a horrible dream one evening. In her nightmare, she'd seen Caesar's body in her arms, having been the victim of assassination. Understandably, Calpurnia was left startled and became convinced that something was going to happen to her husband. The dream had such a profound effect on her that the very morning, she pleaded with her husband not to attend the Senate meeting that was being held that very day, on the 15th of March. Initially, he tried to reassure her, but her anxiety only grew. Her persistence eventually persuaded Caesar to remain at home, a good choice. But then, a trusted lieutenant, Decimus, changed his mind again, and the prominent figure walked straight into his assassination. Despite the warnings of his impending demise, Caesar went to the Senate, where 60 conspirators were waiting for him, daggers at the ready. The dictator made 3 mistakes that led to his early demise. First, he ignored the warnings of a soothsayer, then those of his wife, and then he made the ultimate blunder of trusting a friend. Number 1. When searching for connotations to the word brutal, several historical figures come to mind. One of them is the notorious 13th century warrior, Genghis Khan. Khan has many adjectives associated with him: powerful, brilliant, adaptable, ruthless. Missing from the list are concepts of level-headedness and understanding. That's because the founder of the Mongol Empire was neither of those things. We don't know much about the most merciless man in history, such as what he looked like, but we do know that he was greatly feared, and for a good reason. It turned out that during the era when Genghis Khan dominated, few knew the true extent of his cold-blooded nature. The failure to understand this concept would ultimately lead to history-altering blunders. It was the early 13th century when the Mongol leader sought to establish trade with his neighbors, the Khwarezmian Empire. Of course, he was in search of a peaceful exchange, one that would better his own empire. The Khwarezmian Empire was a powerful empire that took over much of present-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Iran. At the time, it was ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. In 1218, Khan decided to send a caravan of Muslim merchants to the city of Urtrar, which was controlled by the Khwarezmians. His wishes were to open conversations about trade, hoping to establish some sort of exchange. But once the caravan arrived, the governor made a terrible mistake. He accused the merchants of being spies and ordered their arrest. Despite proclaiming their innocence, the governor ordered that the entire group be executed. Only one of Khan's ambassadors would escape the massacre and return with news to his leader. Outraged by what he had heard, Khan decided to send a diplomatic mission to the Shah, demanding that the governor be reprimanded for his unjust treatment of the merchants. He also wished for reparations to be made for the loss of life and loss of property. Once Muhammad II heard these demands, he would make the next fatal error. He refused to comply with the wishes and added yet another insult on top of it all by beheading the chief envoy of the mission. The Shah even returned the decapitated head back to the Mongols. It was this erroneous decision that would mark a pivotal altercation in the course of history. The Khwarezmian Empire picked a fight with the most feared man of the century. Angered by the sheer lack of respect that he was met with, not once but twice, Khan allowed his brutality to take hold. In 1219, he brought together a force of 100,000 to 150,000 men who stormed the empire's richest cities. It didn't take long for the armies to decimate the cities, leaving bodies in their wake. It was one of the most red-stained wars known to history, one that would see an entire, powerful empire crumble to the ground. By the end of the war, there were somewhere between 2 and 15 million casualties, mostly that of the Khwarezmians. The empire was shattered, all because of a careless blunder of having too much pride. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.